Okay, thank you, members, and to Fáilte of Lig, we have quorum, and I now call the meeting to order and welcome all members to the 41st meeting of the Committee for Communities. Can I remind anyone in the public gallery that mobile phones must be turned off, mobile tablet devices can however be used through a Wi-Fi connection, and all devices should be muted. Password details are available in the gallery for anyone wanting to connect to the Assembly's Wi-Fi network, and no photographs or recordings may be taken, please. Can I also remind members about the protocols regarding the use of electronic devices? Please switch all mobile devices to airplane mode and activate Wi-Fi connection. Please also use tablet devices discreetly and in a way which does not interfere with proceedings, and be aware of the cameras and sensitivity of the microphones throughout the meeting. And finally, I'd remind members of your responsibility to declare any interest in any of the items under discussion today. Does any member have any interest to declare in relation to today's agenda? No, thank you, members. So moving on to apologies then. Clerk, do we have any apologies today?
We have no apologies, Chair, but we have a few members who are going to be appearing on Zoom. Mr McHugh, potentially Mr Bradley and Mr Allen.
Okay, thank you. And members aware of any apologies? No, thank you. Okay, members, moving on then to Chairperson's business. So, members, we will have a closed session at the end of today's meeting to discuss our draft recommendations for the Minister and Department following on from the arts sector consultation survey and the engagement event that we did in the Long Gallery, the World Cafe event. So I'd encourage everyone to please stay on for this session if possible, and it should last no longer than 20 minutes. Moving on then to there has been an NIO audit report regarding homelessness, which members I'm sure will have picked up on, and there's a ministerial statement regarding the purchase of 600 homes to address that, or to start to address that. The NIO report highlights significant financial and operational challenges faced by the housing executive, particularly the escalating costs of temporary accommodation and the persistent shortfall in social housing supply. The report raises serious questions about the sustainability of current approaches and the effectiveness of existing strategies in tackling homelessness. Given the scale of public expenditure involved and the clear need for better outcomes, I propose, members, that we begin by asking the Housing Executive how quickly they will be able to react in light of the Minister's announcement, if members will be content with that.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you. Members, just also to note, at this point, the Chancellor's Spring Statement 2025, which is flagging up further cuts to benefit and systems and supports for people, I think that's something that we will need to come back to in terms of the detail. And we have some letters in with the Minister and various other bodies that have obviously now even greater importance than they were when we first issued those. And just to reflect the concern that's out there around all of that. So lastly, members, in terms of the committee's ongoing work programme, the committee team received an email from the department late on Friday afternoon. It's contained there, page 5 of your pack, advising that in terms of departmental briefings for today's meeting, they were going to have to defer both the anti-poverty strategy and historic environment, culture and creativity briefings. You will remember that the latter briefing had already been deferred previously at the department's request. The department's email states these deferrals are due to the announcements that on welfare cuts and due to the impacts these have within the department, and that they are unavoidable. The department has now proposed the following: that we will have an anti-poverty strategy briefing mid to late April, and that the historic environment, culture and creativity, regarding to that briefing, that the department will make contact to arrange a more suitable date. So Kelly and then Sian.
Look, I appreciate that we can get people, somebody could be sick or whatever's going on. I don't think that having a budget could prevent, the work that has been ongoing on the anti-poverty strategy and the historic environment, culture and creativity briefing. So I'm really disappointed that they're not coming to see this committee. Now, I know they've talked about when they may be available, but we have other things that we're getting on with. I'm just wondering if there's another way that we can get access to this information, because at this stage we're not being offered any written alternative. Is there a problem with the number of people who are working on these things within the department? It's just getting to the stage where it feels like as a committee we're being bypassed.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Sian?
Yeah, really disappointed. I think that we've been asking for an update on where we are with the anti-poverty strategy for a long time, even in terms of where the development of it is. I know that it's obviously, if the Minister is taking it forward to executive, there's been some issue there where he said that the executive has to see it before us, and I just don't understand how having announcements of a green paper or any changes in Westminster is impacting the work on an anti-poverty strategy to the point where the department cannot brief the committee that is designed to scrutinise and support it. In terms of the historic culture and creativity, I see no justification for another delay. It's a department, you know, those that are working on the creativity and arts policy pieces, I don't believe are in any way involved in any work that is related to the most recent cuts or most recent announcements of cuts. I think this is now the third time that this has been deferred, if I'm right, Chair. And I think second then. So I feel like we've been asking for an update from the department on this for quite some time. We're being told by those in the sector that they are told that these policies will be out to consultation before the end of this year in terms of June. So if there's now 2 months, 3 months down the line, why are we not being updated on the work that section of the department is doing? So I'm quite frustrated.
Thank you, Sian.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to agree with Sian and Kelly on what they've said there. This is very disappointing and concerning. And I suppose the fact that we have had these announcements on welfare cuts and the spring statement yesterday, and the huge concerns right across society how this is going to impact our most vulnerable, it actually means we really, it gives, there's greater importance in us actually having evidence and detail on the anti-poverty strategy. There's a need for it now more than ever. So yeah, I share the concerns of both Kelly and Sian in that regard.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? We have a document, Timescales for Interaction between the Assembly Committees and Departments, and in that it says statutory committees play a pivotal role in ensuring the full and proper accountability of the Executive to the Assembly. We can't do that because we're not getting the information, and I just wonder, I'm sure you may well have an idea about maybe the Minister or what way we can take this forward, but we need to find out what is going on, why this committee is being set aside. If we are being prevented from delivering our role as a legal statutory committee, the question has to be asked. You know, the media finds out things before us. There are announcements made left, right and centre, and we're provided with the press releases on it after the fact. So departments should be seeking to engage with us. Instead, they're refusing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we will need to consider how, in light of the cancellation of these, how that ground gets made up and how that gets done. I think there's also, I would be very keen to know what the exact impacts are in terms of the number of people that have now had to be diverted to look at the issue of the statement, and what other impacts there are, what other work is not being done as a result of that. So I think it would be useful for us to write to find out what those impacts are. They're not detailed here. I'd like to see the detail of them, because obviously they're impacting not only on us but potentially on other work within the department. I also would be concerned to know that the deadline for the anti-poverty strategy, which is so long awaited now, is not going to shift in any way, and I think we should communicate our concern on that issue to the department as well, if members are content.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, members, you'll also recall that we had suggested a number of informal briefing sessions with officials. The DALO has informed the team that, having spoken with senior officials regarding the list of informal sessions, they have requested the following: that the Pension Schemes Bill, 8th of April 2025. There's a number of other ones, such as pinch points of HSS benefit fraud and error, regulatory framework for gambling, universal credit, complex lives and supporting people. So those were suggested by the department really as informal information sessions. They're now being scheduled or seeking to be scheduled as formal briefings. So I'm very disappointed with the cancellation and the timing of it late on Friday evening. That creates a huge amount of work for the team here to have to schedule a committee session at very short notice. And I want to thank the team for the work they've had to do at very short notice to put together today's meeting. Also, to point out that we were asked initially by the department to consider informal sessions in relation to topics that members of the committee continued to raise question and follow-up queries on. We had done one on universal credit that members, and I think the department, found useful. However, the position seems to have shifted now, leaving just one informal session for the pension scheme bill. So any comments, members, or anything you wish to note on that? Kelly?
I'm a little bit concerned about the approach here. The committee has matters and issues that it needs to consider, and we certainly, the list that has been provided are things that of course we should be interested in. It feels more like everything's being moved into informal discussion and being led by the department telling us what we should be considering, as opposed to what we as a committee are concerned about and need to look at. How many of these I just get worried about the informal sessions, because if it's not done with public scrutiny, of our work and how we're delivering as a committee and what officials are saying. I don't know, Chair. I'm getting a bit frustrated if our official meetings are being postponed and cancelled and these informal meetings seem to be taken over. This committee is effectively going into private session.
We're just saying, so the proposal from the department here is to move those into formal, and there is certainly merit in having those informal. They were sort of pitched as information sessions. They're going into formal sessions, and I think they're all crucially important issues. But it's just to flag up the department had asked for them. But it has also created serious problems with room bookings and things like that had been booked for these sessions. I think that's the more. But we certainly will look forward to being able to scrutinise.
Our papers are provided to the department. I'm sure they know what our forward work programme is. They know that they have legislation coming up. Are they controlling this committee?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Melissa, go ahead, Melissa.
Just on exactly the same point, Chair, I think it's critical that we take responsibility as a committee, and that we set the agenda, and it is not set for us by either the department or minister or whoever. It's in fact this committee that takes responsibility for itself. They decide what it is that we're going to have our hearings on.
Yeah. Would members be content that we write also to the department in relation to those matters and expressing our dissatisfaction and pointing to the evidence sessions at the department that the committee has requested? There's an expectation that the department will facilitate those in the order they're requested. Brian?
Yep. Well, in terms of the list there, matters which the department's suggesting we could get briefings on and sessions on. Many of these are things that have came up in the committee. Certainly with the other committee that I'm on, we do ask the department what is coming through, what are the matters that we need to be kept up to date on. So I don't think it's unreasonable that we are advised these are things that are coming through. And all of these, reading through the list, are things that have been raised at our meetings. There's a number there I would be interested in those sessions on benefit, fraud and error, the gambling framework, complex lives, supporting people. Are we being asked to select from these, or are we saying all of these go through, or do we put that into our forward planning session at some stage?
So first of all, on that respect, we have asked for information around the legislative timetabling for the department, which we're waiting on. But these sessions have been what has been sent to us on Friday afternoon. These were being moved from informal sessions into formal sessions, and we will work those in. The point about that is coming so late in the day, and I'm making the point that the department had asked for them to be informal. The department had asked for that, and we had agreed to that on the basis of that they were to share information. But however, that is the case now. But I think in terms of planning and scheduling, it is crucial that the committee team here are able to have a certainty around key briefings, and I think that point needs to be should be referred back to the department. Kelly,
my concern is if the department are moving these into formal session, which is not a bad thing, are they going to turn up? Because we're seeing that they're not turning up when we've asked them to do other things. So it's that that level of communication and trust between us and the department. You know, we've had discussions with the department on this and raised our concerns, and they've certainly, you know, fed into us their concerns too, but it doesn't really bode well when this is the third time that we can't get, you know, two change dates coming through, and the third time that part of the department can't provide us with an update on something as important as the anti-poverty strategy is being knocked back. So I just would be concerned if we could communicate back to the department, love the list, we may have more to add to that, but are you actually going to turn up?
Yeah, and just to note that we have replaced that session with people who have worked on the anti-poverty, so we can draw some more of that out in the session today. Nicola?
Chair, was there any justifications to why they moved it from informal to formal, or what was the reason behind it?
No, I don't think there was really any rationale given for that.
It really doesn't seem to make sense. If our forward work programme is already jam-packed, is this going to push it way down the line so that we don't get to actually hear from these ones for a long time, whenever they are issues that, as Brian said, has come through committee before, and we do want to get more information on, just to furnish ourselves with that information. So it is a bit peculiar now, I do think.
Well, listen, I'll ask the clerk to do us up maybe a bit of a report when she's back in terms of the impact and how that might be managed, because there is certainly going to be, given the very packed schedule that this committee has, any of these changes create significant knock-on difficulties, and that's not good enough, to be quite frank. Okay, members, thank you for that. Moving on then to agenda item 3, draft minutes. Can I refer members to the draft minutes from the meeting on 20th of March, which are page 7 of the meeting pack? Are members content to agree the minutes of 20th of March as drafted?
Agreed.
Thank you, members. Matters arising then, members. You've been provided with a summary table of matters arising at page 18. I will, as usual, go through these items by number and group and ask viewers to draw out, highlight or seek briefings in relation to any specific item. So can I ask members if they have any comment on items 4.2 to 4.6? Go ahead, Sharon.
Just 4.3, the reply on bringing welfare reform mitigation statutory report. I welcome just getting some of those figures. I think that was one of the informal briefings that we actually had asked to have, was really understanding where this fraud is coming from and how it's being dealt with. And I mean, for me, I agree with the narrative that we've heard around that £163 million being channeled through customer fraud is unacceptable. I do, however, challenge the narrative that it's being conflated with these cuts, and particularly people with disabilities. I will challenge that all day long, because I think there have been a conflation of the two. We have to address fraud, but we also have to address error. £26 million on department error. I haven't really heard an awful lot about it, and I know that we've talked in this committee about how, when that statement was brought forward by the Minister, we really did get an awful lot of focus on the fraud and not much on the error. So I think for me that's where the frustration comes, Chair, where we're pushing these briefings down the road, because it would be really helpful for us to understand where are the pinch points. Is it the computer system? Is it human error? Where's that coming from? And what is being done to nip it in the bud for next year? So it's more a kind of, I suppose, a comment than any sort of question for the department, but it underlines how frustrated I am that we're not getting some of those briefings.
Yeah. Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, but just on that same matter, on the report on the welfare reform mitigations, I mean, the amount there that's put down as overpayments due to fraud, error or official error of £240 million is eye-watering. You know, when we look at the various other mitigations that we can't afford to cover from our block grant. And I know this is money that's coming through DWP, but there is, I understand, an opportunity through the Fresh Start agreement that money saved on benefit fraud can be retained within Northern Ireland, or at least a large part of it. And so I look forward to that briefing, and that we can find more about the potential for that. But I mean, there's a serious concerns just about the public purse there, you know, that they, and how that can be reduced and eliminated.
Thanks, Brian. Melissa? Lanneray?
Just as on 4.2, Chair, to express my disappointment that once again, like of the 419 additional jobs that have been allocated to Belfast, that it's worth noting that the vast majority of these jobs are suitable for hybrid working, which will allow staff to avail of working from both the office and from home. And in particular, in the likes of West Tyrone and Fermanagh, we could have benefited from a relocation of many of those particular posts there. And once again, it's a whole area that has been ignored.
Yep, I think that's definitely something that I would be concerned about as well. And in fact, we were told at the time of the announcement that there wasn't the infrastructure in either Tyrone, Armagh or Fermanagh, and yet it turns out that a hybrid was a possibility. So that doesn't really chime with what we were told at the time. In relation to the fraud and error there, so I've maybe asked the clerk to look at when we can get that scheduled in. There's obviously concern around that, so we'll see how we can get that worked into the forward work programme. Okay, members then, anything else on 4.2 to 4.6, or am I okay to go ahead, Sian?
Apologies, Chair, it's just under the Children's Services Cooperation Act at 4.5. Understand why we're throwing it back over to the Department for Finance, but it would be good to hear from the department in terms of how CSCA is actually currently being used, because we do know that this will have a huge impact on how an anti-poverty strategy will be rolled out, especially around children's services and anything to do with child poverty. So I think there is a question to be answered there from the department. I'd like to know at the minute what is going on in terms of how they're utilising that piece of legislation to ensure that children are being kept at the forefront of any legislation that's come through, particularly around anti-poverty. So I appreciate that Department for Finance looks after the arrangements and the outworkings of that piece of legislation, but there's also some input needed there from the Department for Communities. So I would suggest, if possible, that we go back to the department and just say, can we get an outline of what is currently being done within the department around that piece of legislation?
Yeah. I thought it was curious wording. They may wish to use the potential of the Children's Services Cooperation Act. Like, I would have thought it would more, they will take full account of the requirements of the Act. I thought would have, it seemed a strange way to put it. So if members are content, we seek, as Sian has suggested, some further detail from the department. Yep. Members content? Thank you. You content with it?
We will take that forward, Chair.
Yep. Okay, members, then item 4.7 to 4.8. Are there items within that? I do want to flag up item 4 comment on 4.8, and there's a response to a letter that we sent here to TEO on the importance of co-design in developing strategies. And I mean, co-design is a fundamental built into the New Decade, New Approach agreement. It's also best practice in terms of policy setting. That was redirected to the Department of Finance, an approach that I wouldn't be content with. I think if we sent a letter to TEO, we should get a response from TEO. I don't think the letter even went the length of TEO. It was redirected to Finance, so just want to take members' views on that.
In the last mandate, I would have been part of the discussion with the Executive Office on co-production and co-design and how much work had been done across the departments to understand that work and the working together. So it is quite surprising that it's being directed to Department of Finance. I don't know why it's going to Finance, because I know that there's things about personnel issues and stuff. HR would be in Finance, but co-production and co-design is an executive way of working, that goes across all departments. So it is a bit surprising. I suppose we'll have to wait until we see what Department of Finance come back with, but it sort of doesn't get to the understanding of what the intent and the intention and how co-design and co-production is understood by civil service.
Yeah, and I think I think we should reiterate that we want this correspondence going to TEO as well. Okay, share it with Finance by all means, and let's hear from both of them. But I don't think redirecting it in that sense is appropriate. It should go now. If TEO come back and say they have asked Finance to pick up or whatever, that's fair enough. If that has merit, we'll look at that. But I don't think just it simply being diverted at that level is really appropriate. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, well, just on that topic, I mean, we had some of this debate when the panel was in. I suppose it is the need to ensure that there's an understanding of the process when there's a co-design group or an expert panel, what their role is. And as I said, and I think the panel members who were in accepted, at some stage it has to go into a departmental process and ultimately go to the executive committee and go to the assembly. It has to go into a political process. So there's an understanding of what their role is, but also when it becomes a political, where it's through elected representatives, who are appointed by the people, when we're setting public policy. So this is a debate that keeps coming up about political accountability and setting public policy. So I'd accept there's a need for proper terms of reference, so it's understood what the role is of co-design groups, and maybe that's why it was referred to Department for Finance. Maybe whether there is a standard terms of reference, so the role is understood.
Well, this committee has made it very clear that we expect the people who contributed to the various strategies would be maintain contact with. The process, the more fundamental process of co-design, is one which I also believe this committee is broadly supportive of and wish to see continue. Any thoughts, members, on that?
I think it's that point. Brian makes it well about the groups that come in to see us. It's not clear. And it's not clear across all the departments of how co-production and co-design is being used and handled, and that's why we're looking for this information. If we have a clear outline of how the expectations are of the use of co-production and co-design, and that takes into Brian's point as well about the groups that are involved and what are their role and what are the expectations, then that makes it a lot easier for us to see if the process is working, or if it isn't working, or if it breaks down at some point, or there's a decision to move away from it at some point when that's not in keeping with the process. So that's why we're trying to get to the core of this. I don't think Department of Finance will have anything to do with the terms of reference with the groups that any department bring in, because it will be for the department to set that, because it's their process. It'd be different if it was a contract, because then that would go through procurement, but these guys aren't getting paid. They're coming at this being asked to contribute to something out of their own time, out of their own organisation's pockets at some cases, to pay for people to be available to respond. So that's why we need the system and to see if that works. And to be honest, at some stage, if we can't get to the bottom, but maybe we need to engage colleagues at the Executive Office Committee, I think you're on that, to see if they have access to this, because it is New Decade, New Approach, a process that was agreed then for the whole executive. So,
Sean?
I just feel like there's clearly something that's not working in this process. We now have those involved with the gender equality strategy, those involved with the Irish language strategy, those involved with the disability strategy, and the arts sector who was widely consulted on investing in creative delivery. Those are the most recent examples where people have invested their time, often in overcapacitated sectors like the community model sector, the arts sector, and they've invested their time, and they feel, and they told us, each one of those groups involved told us they felt disrespected, they felt discarded, and they felt that their work had been kind of cast aside. So whilst I totally agree, Brian, that there is a process and there is a timeline, and at some point it moves out of the hands of those who are working on it and into departmental kind of processes and the political process, there's something wrong in the communication of the process. If people are telling us they feel disrespected, that their time has been wasted, and I think we have to listen to that, and we have to understand there's something that's not working within our co-design processes. So to be told by the Executive Office that let's pass it over to one particular committee, I think it doesn't sit well with me.
So just to flag up to members, we have written to the executive separately to the letter I referred to earlier. We have written to the Executive Office asking around that process, and we're waiting a reply from that. There's an outstanding letter into that, so we should be getting more information in relation to that part of it. We should be getting more information back from the Executive Office. Brian?
No, and I would be keen to see that. I think there should be standard terms of reference, so the rules understood. I mean, our letter was actually about terms of reference for civil servants too. So do those exist in a standard form? And and there was a comment made at our last committee meeting, which I felt was disrespectful of officials, and it's easy to make throwaway comments, and that's happened at committee meetings before. So I think members need to be careful about making accusations, of people who are not in a position to respond.
Okay, that's a separate item to this item here, so we'll be coming to that as well. Any other comments, members, in relation to items 4.7 to 4.8?
Just one last one on this one. Would it be worthwhile for us to ask the Chair's liaison group if any of the other committees have had sight of the written down process for co-production and co-design?
Yep, members content?
It's just to see if all the committees are aware of it.
Yep, thank you. Okay, thanks, members. So moving on then to, there are a number of further items under matter raising in your table papers there, and they're at page 4 of your table papers, and those contain items 4.10 to 4.14. So can I ask if members have any issues within that they wish to flag or note or discuss? Yeah, members content. Okay, so members then content otherwise as per the memo. Thank you for that. Moving on then to agenda item 5, members, correspondence, and the correspondence memo is at page 91. There's a table correspondence memo at page 29 of your table papers. I'll go through as usual the items by number and group and ask if you wish to draw out, highlight or seek briefings in relation to any specific item of correspondence. So first of all, can I ask if members have any comments on items from 5.2 to 5.5? Kelly, please.
Yeah, can I go to 5.2? Now, while this amount of money is very welcome and I wouldn't want any group not to get it, I'm a little bit concerned that it's restricted to the community and voluntary sector that are funded through communities. There are many other community and voluntary sector organisations that are funded by other departments and they're not in receipt of this support. If we could write, now the department's given that money to groups and that's wonderful, but why is it not the whole community and voluntary sector? Why is it just some groups who are very fortunate that they can get money through communities, but there are other community and voluntary sector organisations that don't? For example, community transport. They're funded through the Department of Infrastructure and they're not going to get any of this type of support. And there's other organisations that are funded through health. It's just to get clarification on the rationale on the decision making of this, is why it was just for one element of the community and voluntary sector, albeit they are the ones that are funded and connected to communities, and why, like, the Charity Commission list exists, why it's not all, and what the rationale is for deciding that. Yeah.
Members content? We seek that.
Well, on the same topic, I just want to welcome that the payment has been made. I think we all would welcome it, and I suppose there has to be some process of deciding which groups get it. I mean, it's groups under the Department for Communities. So if it's related to health, that would be presumably for the department and the health minister. But so I think the groups that the department primarily engages with under the Voluntary and Community Division and Community Empowerment Division, at least there is a defined list then. Otherwise we just get into a process of endless lobbying, you know. So I think certainly the list I looked up and down, I saw all the main groups I'd be aware of within my constituency. And just to comment too, just to welcome the funding from Financial Transactions Capital funding to help support more properties under co-ownership to help 4,000 households buy their own home over the next 4 years. So along with the decision of buying properties to provide temporary accommodation, that's two positive developments, you know, on the housing front.
Kelly, you were looking?
Yeah, just to correct Brian.
The chair, Kelly.
Sorry, it's just the Department for Communities is responsible for the community and voluntary sector, including the Charity Commission, not just some elements of it. So that's why I'm asking. I haven't said that the funding that's being offered is wrong. It's fantastic. Thank you very much. I just need to know the process of how the decision was taken, that only those that are getting money from communities are entitled to it, but other community and voluntary sector who are doing services on behalf of government are not, and just why that decision was taken that way. Now, it could well be money, it could be the availability of information, although the Charity Commission holds all of their details. It could be written around all departments to find out who they are. It's just that rationale of why some and not others.
Okay, and we have agreed to seek that information. Okay, anything else in 5.2 to 5.5?
Sorry, Chair, 5.3, that pivotal report, it might be worthwhile. They've asked a question in it about what an integrated community will look like, and I know that the department does do sterling work when it comes to shared housing, but have they any plans to follow through on that type of community building, especially as it's part of the the T-Buck outcomes and things like that, that would be really useful.
So seek that information from Pivotal?
From the department.
From the department.
Pivotal have asked that question. What is the department's doing? What are they planning to do? What does an integrated community look like for Department for Communities? Yeah.
Members content with that, Brian?
Well, just before we move on, I mean, the letter from the Minister, I've referred to this already, about if we're up to that number.
I'm coming to that in the next section.
Okay.
Coming to that in the next section. Okay, so members, I want then to move on to items 5.6 to 5.8. And I wish members to draw your attention to item 5.7, which is a letter from the Minister in relation to a comment made at our meeting of the 13th of March. Before I seek members' views on this, I just wish to say that I have no doubt that every member of this committee keenly feels their responsibility to scrutinise the department and advise and assist the Minister. My role in that endeavour as chair of this committee is to maintain good order in the proceedings. Members around this table will say things which others may not agree with, and it is most certainly not within my remit to limit or interpret points being made. So any further discussion on this is a matter for the member and the Minister, but is not a topic for this committee. It is, however, good to know the department is taking such a keen interest in our meetings. So, members.
Well, sorry, Chair, I was just struggling getting to the right page there. So, I think the letter is justified, and we all can make comments at times, but I'm aware when we're on a committee, and it's happened the other way around, where some experts who come, people's lived experience, come to give evidence and make comments about statutory organisations, and can make comments which mightn't be balanced, and trying to make a point, and then officials have to come back and refute that and say that they don't feel that is representative. So I think we all have to be careful, especially a lot of civil servants aren't in a position where they can respond to allegations that are made and criticisms that are made.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly.
Yes, just to say that I've noted the male members' comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, any other views on items from 5.6 to 5.8?
Can I just come in about the Balmoral show, please? I don't know what we're planning to do with it. I know that there'll be other departments and committees that might, be taking up the space. For instance, I imagine the DAERA committee will be doing that. But I don't know, is there something there about us and reaching out to the rural community about the impacts of universal credit and how they're working with it? And I don't know if we have capacity, to be honest, to do it. But even if we could even feed into what the committee for ERA are discussing, just to see if that comes up, if they want to share that information with us, if we're not taking a space ourselves.
Yeah, and I think the clerk had already checked out if it would be possible to do our meeting, but that slot will be gone. It may be worthwhile maybe asking the clerk to take a look at how we might engage, say, maybe around the sign languages bill, or, as you say, universal. I think there's a number of issues there. Rural housing, is another issue that has been raised quite frequently here. So maybe it will be an idea to see how committee staff could look at some kind of outreach or taking the opportunity to engage in some sense during that show. I know there's probably lots of us engaged in the show in lots of ways, and there's a highlight event in that sense. So maybe it's worthwhile asking the team to take a look at what might work in the interest of engagement.
I know that in the past Rural Support Network have been really good in now that was I engaged with them at the Ballymoney show and the Ballymena show, but didn't see them at the Balmoral show, so I can't say if they were definitely there, but they did a really great kind of engagement piece on universal credit. But I definitely think there's space specifically for like the universal credit element of farmers, I suppose the fluctuating what is the word? Income. There we go.
That has been raised, indeed. Any other thoughts on that, members, or any other items within that group, 5.6 to 5.8?
Sorry, 5.6, Chair.
Yeah.
That financial provisions bill, there's information in that. I think we need to get a wee bit more on what that. It seems a bit early at this stage. So the financial provisions bill is going to include a piece on tenancy fraud. And there will need to be, obviously, we don't want fraud happening in any case, but I think we need to find out how that's going to be investigated and how that's going to work. It's a bit like the sanctions that could be coming through you know, to stop abuse of the welfare system, but it'd be the same for the housing. We need to see, is that going to be the department? Is it going to be the housing executive? If it's the housing executive, how does that apply then to, you know, housing benefit paid in other tenures? I think we need to be a bit more detail on that one, and it might be early days, to be fair to the department on this, because it's part of that financial provisions bill, but I'm sure that the department have fed into what could be possible.
So asking for further information on
from
that?
the communities, yeah.
Members content with that? Okay, members, then moving on to tabled items, which are 5.10 to 5.3 and are contained at pages between 30 and 47 of your table pack. Do members have any items there that they wish to draw out? Or a particular 5.10 there does require a committee view in relation to reducing gambling harm. So would members if it's I'll ask members if you wish to forward the correspondence to the all-party group as requested. Are members content with that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other items in 5.10 to 5.13, members, or are members otherwise content? Yep. Thank you, members. Okay, members, so before we move into agenda item 6, we need to pause broadcasting for a few minutes just to get the interpreters in place for this session. So we'll ask the clerk to pause broadcasting, and that will take a few minutes.
That's us back in, Chair.
Okay, thank you, members. And we are now moving into agenda item 6, Sign Language Bill Update on Call for Evidence and Engagements. Mm-hmm. Members, you have been provided with a memo from the clerk at page 196. Can I ask members if members have any comments on the memo, or are you content that the committee's call for evidence is extended until 9th of May 2025? Kelly, go ahead.
Chair, I agree that we do extend to give the best possible opportunity for people to respond. My question is about our role during some of the participation events. Are we permitted as committee members to attend as observers? And if there's any possibility with those events, if it's not appropriate, then that's fine. But if we're able to attend the in-person events just to see and hear what's being said, I think that would be quite useful, but not to take part if that's possible. But whenever the dates and times and the venues are known, if that could be shared, if we are permitted to be observers, that would be really helpful. The other thing was I have been contacted by a few people that have started to sort of filter through information. I don't believe that they have been in contact with the committee. What would you prefer us to do with that information? Now, obviously, I need to get permission if it's okay to send those comments in, but it's just to know the process that we as members should follow with that one.
Well, on the first issue, first of all, to say absolutely, members not only are permitted, but absolutely encouraged, and we certainly hope to have members at all of the sessions, and indeed all members as far as possible.
Chair, we've just got information in there. There are 3 in-person and 1 online event.
Yeah, okay.
So members will be invited specifically to all of those, and will be encouraged to attend.
And if necessary, we will seek to maybe ensure that between us we are covering all of the events, so that we can feed back in some way. I will ask the clerk to give us information as to how any information coming in that way can be facilitated and included as part of the formal, just to see how that will be managed. Sian, you were looking in there.
Yes, it's actually just about those in-person meetings and just around the location of them. I know Foyle, Strabane, Omagh, Dungannon, Newry, Banbridge and Belfast. There is a big gap there, and it obviously covers that North Antrim, East Antrim area, which is quite vast. You're looking at over an hour to travel to Foyle, over an hour to travel to Belfast. So I'm just wondering if there's any capacity, if we are trying to be as inclusive as possible, to maybe look at something for that kind of mid-Antrim area. I just think that would be really helpful.
So could we ask that to be looked at? Yeah, members content with that. Thank you, Sian. That's an important point of information. So can I ask then, just going back to the call for evidence that we're extending till 9th of May, are members agreed with that?
Agreed.
Thank you, members. Thank you. We'll just take them again. Yep. So we'll just pause again for another moment or two.
That's us back in session, Chair.
Thank you, Clerk, and thank you, members. So we're resuming then at agenda item 7, and this is SL1, the Universal Credit, Personal Independence Payment, Jobseekers Allowance and Employment and Support Allowance, open brackets, Claims and Payments, close brackets, Amendment and Modification Regulations, NI 2025, and these are contained at page 202 of your pack. The proposed rule, members, will move child maintenance deductions in the priority order that deductions are taken from universal credit. It also provides for the amendment of the current priority order by placing water charges below fines in the priority order to mirror the corresponding Department for Work and Pensions legislation and to maintain parity. Do members have any comments, or are they content for the Department to proceed to make the rule?
Yeah, I think I would welcome this in terms of ensuring that the parent with custody has no barriers put in place, or less barriers put in place, to actually get what is owed in terms of child maintenance. So I think this is positive.
Thank you, Sian. Members, otherwise then, are members agreed that the Department proceed to make the rule?
Yeah.
Thank you, members. Okay. Agenda item 8 then, this is SR 2025, the period products, Department for Communities, specified public service bodies, regulations, NI 2025, and they're contained at page 211 of your pack. So members, we considered the SL1 at our meeting on the 30th of January when we were content for the Department to proceed to make the rule. Do members have any objection to the rule? No. Therefore, can I ask formally that the Committee for Communities has considered SR 2025, the period products, Department for Communities, specified public service bodies, regulations, NI 2025, and recommends that it is affirmed by the Assembly. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you, members. Agenda item 9 then, members, we're moving into our first briefing today, and this is by the NI Anti-Poverty Network. Members, a copy of the briefing paper is in your table papers at page 50. So I now wish to welcome the following representatives to the meeting. So we are being joined by Becca, who is Development Coordinator. And we are being joined by Dr. Ciara Fitzpatrick, who is Vice Chair of the Anti-Poverty Network. So Becca, I think it's yourself that's going to make the opening remarks, and we'll then obviously get to questions from members. So thank you both. And thank you for appearing today at pretty short notice. I understand you're very busy yourselves, but we really appreciate you coming to committee in short notice like that.
Well, thank you for having us, and we're happy to be here today. And I just want to acknowledge that the importance of the mitigations package that has been extended right now for the next for the mandate, I think is just so important, and I just haven't seen you since then, so I wanted to acknowledge that. I heard Minister Gordon Lyons on the radio this morning saying that the anti-poverty strategy will be delivered to look at next week, and I look forward to that. Obviously, we wanted to hear about it all today, so it'll be good to hear that next week. Obviously, you know, since last we've been here that there has been a High Court ruling on a judicial review saying that the executive is in breach of Section 228E with its duty to adopt an anti-poverty strategy, and that is an anti-poverty strategy based on objective need. And so, again, the importance of it is no surprise to anyone. But I think one of the importance of this committee is to obviously make sure that any anti-poverty strategy is meeting the criteria of a strategy. And so you have amazing tools in front of you right now. You have the Public Accounts Committee recommendations around the child poverty strategy for you to use, as well as the audit report on that strategy. And I just want to remind yourselves what it says. For a strategy to be effective, there must be specific poverty reduction targets throughout the duration of the strategy. It needs to have focus, prioritization that's reflected in its monitoring, The DFC needs to lead and show leadership, but also it needs to be cross-departmental, and there needs to be joined up working. There must be a ring-fenced budget for delivery of the targets within the strategy, and the overarching framework should be invest to save, whereby policies that focus on early intervention and prevention should be prioritized. These should be the criteria for which you compare the anti-poverty strategy that you will see, whether or not it will be a good and solid strategy moving forward. There's deep concern regarding the exclusion of the co-design group moving forward and sort of a general exclusion of civil society. When the minister said that the outsourcing, this is a quote, public policy to lobby groups was something he was going to stop doing. And so we have a question from those of us within, civic society. What is the process now? What is that back and forth between yourselves in government, in the department, and those of us who have really are experts in the field, who have conducted a huge amount of research, who are in many ways the connection to lived experience when it comes to poverty and when it comes to different people. And so Northern Ireland Anti-Poverty Network, we have a lived experience advisory panel, which I meet with every 3 weeks or so. And I just wanted to share with you throughout this presentation just a few of their own concerns and thoughts, because I asked them if they had a chance to talk to the Communities Committee, what would they say? And they're concerned about the direction of the conversation around benefits, the conversation around poverty, the direction of the conversation around people who are entitled versus not entitled, and what that means in terms of a society that is compassionate and all of that. So we are concerned. Doing nothing is obviously not an option. We are seeing increased rates of child poverty. I anticipate, although I don't know because we haven't gotten the figures in yet for this year, but with the increase of rents within the private rental sector, we anticipate that there'll be an increase of poverty, particularly those who are in the private rental sector. We know that the impact of women is absolutely detrimental. They are not only the shock absorbers of poverty, they're also the managers of the household, they're also the carers of children and people who are often dependent on them, and that there's a huge amount of research that has done within the women's sector, particularly Siobhan Harding and the Women's Support Network around what does that impact actually look like. And then obviously we'll talk a lot about disability cuts in a moment. So it matters how we talk about people on benefits, and that dignity and compassion is at the front, and we're concerned about any focus on benefit fraud. We think that is wrong-headed. Only 2% of the DFC expenditure is on benefit fraud and departmental error. PIP fraud, as you know, is between 0 and 0.2%. It is so small in comparison to the real issues of poverty. People cannot make ends meet, and until you address the root cause of people not being able to make ends meet, having the whole conversation about benefit fraud is not only a distraction, but it's dangerous because it maligns people who are in poverty and makes people feel horrible. This is a quote from someone in our lived experience advisory panel. Why are we always being questioned or having to prove that we're entitled? If our doctors and medical team have diagnosed our illness or disability, there is no need for this whole process. It just puts us under pressure. Another quote, I feel like they're always trying to catch us out. Personal debt, as we heard this morning in the most recent report from the Consumer Council and Advice on I, is that it's increased by 42% in the last 4 years to £13,000. Another member of our lived experience panel, I just can't survive these days without being in debt. I rely on credit to afford my bills. Why are we made to pay more for bills like gas and electric and then hear about these companies that have made record profits or their CEOs' salaries have doubled? It's insulting. Utilities should be nationalized, and it's not something for people to profit on the backs of ordinary people. It's unfair. Half of households in poverty include a person with disability. And furthermore, more than 1 in 5 disabled people live in relative poverty in Northern Ireland. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the picture of disability, and Ciara is going to talk about the impact of the cuts that were announced yesterday. So the reality, as you know, is that disabled people in Northern Ireland, there's a higher percentage, 20% more of rates of disability and ill health than the rest of the UK. And there's an extremely strong correlation between the areas that saw the worst violence and the troubles, ongoing deprivation, and high rates of disability and ill health. PIP is supposed to be an equity payment, a payment to help people who have a disability live their lives and pay for that disability. And that equity payment is not even close to the cost of disability. So Scope Charity said the average cost of a disability is $1,100 a month. And the United Nations has criticized the UK at having a disability payment that is not enough for people to actually make ends meet. And so currently PIP payments range from $1,500 to $9,610 per year, which means that that's $800 a month if you are on the highest rate of PIP, which again is over £200 short per month of what it actually costs on average for a disability. So it's showing you just how the status quo is not enough. And that's why we see people higher rates of poverty in the disabled population. There's a mental health crisis in Northern Ireland, as you are well aware of. I don't need to go into the stats around that. You can read the briefing. But we know that the relationship between poverty and ill mental health is well-founded, well-researched. And so the mental health crisis needs to be addressed rather than immiserating and impoverishing more people, which will again add to our mental health burden and the burdens of already stretched services. So our conversation has to be about supports, interventions, well-being, rather than cuts, sanctions, and further stigmatization. And the last thing I want to say is about jobs, because I think jobs is really important, and I imagine that in an anti-poverty strategy that you're going to be seeing, hopefully next week, there's going to be a lot about getting people into work. And so I think we need to look at what the evidence says around what we need around that. So first of all, policies need to ensure that they are person-centric, compassionate, and strive to understand and value the real lived experience of those impacted. Mm-hmm. For people who are disabled, research shows that those who are out of work want to work at a higher rate than those who are not disabled. And on average, disabled people submit 2.5 times as many job applications for fewer callbacks than people who are not disabled. So there are real barriers for getting even your first hire, so to speak. There's a lot of work that needs to be done with employers around reasonable adjustments, around stigma, around the idea that maybe it's going to cost too much or it'll be too much interruption to hire someone who is disabled. And I really encourage this committee to bring in voices from the disabled community over the next few weeks, a few months, around those barriers, understanding them, and so any intervention that is trying to get people into work is one that is based upon people's real lived experience. There's extensive research that place, train, and support in work rather than a job skills program where there's no employment or no concrete job at the other side is a much better strategy. It works a lot better for both employers and for prospective employees, and that's true within disabled communities, but also at large, young people, et cetera, people who are trying to get into work. So programs such as Steps to Success and a lot of the other programs that we're targeting young people need, so not in employment, education, and training. We're putting people through a variety of different jobs trainings, but there wasn't a job at the other end. And there's also a lot of work that needs to be done with employers around how do they change what their employment looks like to actually meet the needs of incoming possible recruits. There's also an issue of disparity across the region, and so you'll be well aware that west of the band there are fewer jobs, lower paid jobs, less flexibility. In rural areas in particular, more of a reliance on cars. Transport is a massive barrier for people with disabilities, but not just with people with disabilities, because people who are reliant on cars, it's more expensive to get to work, and for many people, they report it just doesn't pay to go to work because I'm out of pocket just far too much. So I'm going to move on to Ciara to talk about the implications of the cuts, but we're happy to talk about sort of what are the things that we want to focus on in the anti-poverty strategy that hopefully you will see next week.
Thanks very much. Really pleased to be here today, so thank you. And first of all, I just want to reflect what Becca had said about the welfare reform mitigation package. Often, I've worked in social security and poverty for about 10 years now, and I feel so depressed most of the time about the situation that we're currently in Northern Ireland. But actually the welfare reform mitigation package as a devolved package of measures is something that I feel really proud of, because it's something that the Northern Ireland Executive decided to do that has made such a real difference to people who are at risk of poverty in Northern Ireland. And I just want to also mention the fact that, we did have some flexibilities around the introduction of the new benefit schemes, Universal Credit and PIP, the last time. And, I think that that's something that could be very urgently looked at around these proposals. Even some flexibilities that aren't going to cost an awful lot of money would be a good starting point. And Minister Mervyn Story at the time worked with other organisations to look at what they could be. And I think, it's so urgent that we are in front of the curve here, because we do know that Labour does have a massive majority, and unfortunately, it looks like it's highly likely that these cuts are going to be pressed through, which is very worrying. It's very worrying for Northern Ireland. I'm going to just keep this to a few sentences. We've heard from the OBR that we're going to have at least 250,000 more people pushed into poverty. We have already organisations such as the JRF saying that that's a very conservative estimate. It's probably going to be more like 400,000 people across the UK pushed into poverty, including at least 50,000 children. We know in Northern Ireland that we have 29,000 children experiencing poverty where somebody in the household has a disability. We also know the knock-on effect of the average loss of 4,500 per year for those people that are going to be impacted by these cuts is also going to impact those people who have a carer in the household, because if they lose eligibility to PIP, they're also going to lose eligibility to carers allowance. It also lifts their protection from the benefit cap as well, so they're going to be impacted by that. So we're going to see the cost of that mitigation rise, because we're going to see more people, more households impacted by the benefit cap. I read a really interesting paper last night from Dr. Anne Devlin and colleagues from Queen's University, and the title of the paper is "Why Are Disability Rates So High for Older Working Age Adults in Northern Ireland?" Now, they concentrated on adults in the 50 to 64 age cohort, which is a really important age cohort because, pension age has gone up. We have a lot of people who are unable to work because of ill health and disability, and therefore they are claiming PIP, and they are likely to be impacted. The most important finding for me was that in other countries, and this is sort of the rationale that Rachel Reeves is using for the cut, where we see economic growth, we see the rates of disability claimants come down, and that's normally the pattern. But Northern Ireland has always been an outlier in that respect. So even when our economy has become stronger or has showed evidence of growth, we haven't actually seen the level of disability claimants come down. And a lot of that has to do with what Becca has already talked about, our weaker labour market, and the difficulties that we have had post-conflict. The conflict is a major influence here as to why our rates of disability claimants are so high. So, it's just not going to work. What Rachel Reeves has put out there, that, we're going to drive growth we're going to improve jobs for people, and we're going to invest 1 billion, it's not going to have the same impact here in Northern Ireland, which is why I know you're all on the same hymn sheet in saying that we're going to be disproportionately impacted here, and we really are. And this is layered on top of, you know, really tight times over the last 5 years. Just a couple more quotes is, you know, really worried about the changes to cuts and disability support. It's already stressful having to fight for everything. And the other one that I wanted to mention was the £20 UC payment during COVID really made a difference for me, as did the holiday payments for children. They took these away while the price of everything continued to go up. Everything has only gotten worse. So our baseline is so treacherous at the minute. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic. We did see additional support then, which really worked. The holiday hunger payments, which research from Queen's showed really took the stress off low-income families. You know, we had the £20 top-up payment, which lifted thousands of people out of poverty for that period of time. But now we had that taken away, and we're continuing to be in this period of inflation where the rate of fuel and energy and food and those basic essentials for people are very high, and it's really making it so difficult for families on low and middle incomes to live. And the other thing that Becca didn't mention about employment, and where we're so behind other parts of the UK, and is childcare. And I don't need to tell you that, but it is so vital. And you know, we've heard from the Women's Budget Group that again, we're going to see the sharpest end of these cuts fall on women, because they're most traditionally carers. You know, they're really looking after. They're more likely to be looking after their disabled relatives and friends. And without childcare, without social care, you know, they're not just going to be able to go out into the workplace, as you well know. So that's all I want to say, and just to say that we really need to be in swift mode in terms of planning for how Northern Ireland deals with these cuts, and how we ensure that we protect those people that are in poverty and who are so often silenced and can't speak for themselves around the pain that they're experiencing at the minute.
Okay, thank you, and that's really detailed briefing actually, and very, very welcome from that point of view. It has put a wee bit of pressure in times. We'll just ask members to be as succinct as possible in terms of questions and answers. But I suppose, returning to the anti-poverty strategy, so that strategy was largely drafted in 2022, but it would seem that there has been almost a starting from scratch and a huge redraft in terms of strategy. Would you agree that a substantial redrafting is likely to have occurred at this stage from your understanding?
Yeah, so this is just information that came out in the High Court, and we didn't have any view of anything really except for what was in the High Court, and it's in the timeline that was sort of discussed then. Basically made it seem to us, again, we don't have inside information, was that the minister did not take what was a draft, forward, which is his right to do, but that there wasn't all that much urgency really until the autumn, after the pre-court paper was delivered by CAJ, saying that you might be in, the executive might once again be in breach of the legal duty to implement an anti-poverty strategy. And then there was beginnings of work, of timeline, of bringing together a cross-departmental group and things like that. And that was also when we saw Gordon Lyons say that it looked as though it would be brought forward by the end of this financial year, which if he delivers it the beginning of next week, he will have, kept his word, but it doesn't look like it will be reflective of the past work of either the co-design group or the expert panel, which we find very, very concerning.
I would also just say, there's a history of so much of this. People in the civil society have put in so much time and effort into various processes. So I sat on the expert independent group that looked at discretionary support, for example. Mm-hmm. We had a committee of people that looked at welfare reform mitigations. We had a anti-poverty co-design group. All of these groups have taken a lot of time to look at these issues for the interests of people in Northern Ireland. We've poured a lot of research into it. There was a lot of work done prior to the executive coming to an end, and it's gotten. It really is hugely disappointing that our work has been disregarded and that it's not being brought forward in any form at all. And we are working on the ground with people who are in poverty, so to feel so undermined like that is really disappointing.
Yeah, and I can tell you the committee already this morning have referred to this issue several times, and we have taken several actions in terms of engaging around this very issue. I have to say, I think it's a mistake. I think co-design is where there is real value for departments. I'm on the record for that, and co-production. And actually, I think it should be a reiterative process rather than a one-off event. I also think that the reference to lobby groups is in itself reductive and inaccurate and not helpful in that sense, because these are often people who are experts by experience and represent those patient voices. I think it's also very interesting the debt figures that you flagged up, Becca. To me, those are potentially a ticking time bomb in relation to all of this, and potentially covering up some of even the worst impacts. People aren't coping, they're getting further into debt. And in the midst of all that, we drop in this narrative around disability and removing supports. And actually, I have been on the record publicly in this, dressing that up as an attempt to assist people back in. Some of the people who have actually been excluded from work very unfairly over many years and would welcome support into the work. But really what we're seeing is a balancing of the books and to try to dress that up. But given the cost of living crisis, I think this is an entirely different context from any of the other times in the past when also poor decisions were made, but they're much poorer now given the context we're in and unsustainable. And I would again call on the British government to not move forward with those cuts because they are going to create so many issues. Just
a very quick point on the debt. Christians Against Poverty, it's important for the committee. Their research has found that with the people that they have supported with the debt, that the biggest debt for them, for people in Northern Ireland, is actually social security debt. Yeah. So, it's really important, and as people continue to migrate onto universal credit, you know that one of the Cliff Edge coalitions asks is around the 5-week wait in universal credit, and we've been waiting such a long time to see just the name of the contingency fund change to the universal credit new claimant fund.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have a correspondence that is in process. We have raised that issue before. Final one for me before we go to members. What do you want to see in terms of actions in the anti-poverty strategy?
I think first and foremost, the anti-poverty strategy in terms of actions needs to have investment at the very forefront and has to have investment in sort of the cyclical nature of people's lives. So we need investment in children, first and foremost. We need investment in making sure that there is no child that is growing up in poverty, which means seeing an increase in benefits for children, getting rid of, obviously trying to find some kind of mitigation for the 2-child policy, but also making sure that there's a free school day, implementing a childcare strategy so that it's not just that people can go back into work who have small children, but also so that children have equitable, fair, good access to childcare and to developmentally appropriate learning. I think that's one thing. We need living wages. We need living wages and good working conditions so that people can work can actually be a pathway to get out of poverty. We're not seeing that right now. There needs to be a lot more work, I think, with employers to make sure that there is more flexibility for employees, that there are higher wages, that things like transport to work, investment in public sector in terms of transportation and public transport is increased significantly and subsidized so that people can have access to it. And then obviously housing, that's a massive issue. But a lot of the people on our lived experience panel actually talked about how important housing is in terms of, there's so much money is going to these private landlords, you know, the B&Bs. I mean, this was all over the news, obviously, this week. But why can't we put more of this into building new homes, which I know, obviously, the department is attempting to take forward. But everything feels so temporary because of this. It doesn't give me the space to think long-term about employment or anything, because I don't know where I will be living. The connection between housing insecurity, ill mental health, and then adverse childhood experiences and long-term increased likelihood of a bunch of different ills, whether it's poverty, lack of employment, etc., is well documented and well researched. We have over 5,000 children in temporary accommodation right now. This is the ticking time bomb in terms of long-term ill health and not being able to sort of escape poverty.
I'm currently engaged in the Labour government's child poverty strategy. I'm on the expert group representing Northern Ireland, and it's clear that at a very baseline measure, we need to get rid of the 2-child limit in universal credit. And what I would say is that we have had, you know, an excellent framework of measures that have come out in the review of the welfare reform mitigations. You know, it's a good starting point. Some of the investment that was included in the review, it wasn't huge amounts of money, and it could make a huge difference. The other thing I would say is, you know, the anti-poverty strategy, we need to see social security used as a lever. We need investment in the social security system. That is the main lever to take people out of poverty. And if we don't see that in an anti-poverty strategy, you know, it's going to be really devastating.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to our Deputy Chair, Nicola Bro.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ciara and Becca, for attending here on short notice as well, as we do appreciate. It's such an important issue, and we are really glad to have you here. Listen, the statistics and all that you've been saying today, it's so concerning for so many throughout our society. Like, we know the effects of poverty in society anyway, and these announcements from the British government this week about the impact of the welfare payments and all, they are really concerning for so many people, and I am really concerned with what's just around the corner. But it is good to have you here and discussing it. And that leads me on to my first point. Freddie talked about the removal of the co-design group and developing the strategy. It makes no sense to me. No matter what strategies I've worked on before, you need to have the people on the ground, the experts in the field, to be part of that discussion, to be creating it and co-designing it. To me, that makes total sense. And so I share your frustrations and concerns in the fact that it's been removed. And in that, in those terms, can you tell me what engagement you've recently had with the Minister or with the Department in regards to the anti-poverty strategy?
Specifically, I've had no personal engagement, but it should be said that, you know, I haven't, for example, written to the Minister to ask for a meeting or anything like that. So, you know, it's not that I would expect that engagement. You know, I am also, Becca and I are also part of the Cliff Edge Coalition, and, you know, we've been campaigning since 2018 to extend and strengthen the welfare reform mitigations, and we haven't had any engagement with the Minister around that either, and we hope to in the future. But yeah.
I just want to add about the anti-poverty strategy. We're waiting. And we're waiting, and we're waiting, and that is the entire reason why there was the High Court case and why there was the judicial review, because we can't keep having conversations without looking at a document, you know, and there's no point continuing to do that. So, again, next week, I'm hoping that there's something that we can actually have a conversation about, because for the last, you know, year, we've been talking about something we actually longer than a year, because even the co-design group never saw what the department was working on. They just published. Some members published their recommendations, and so I think that's really important. Is that we actually have never worked with something concrete from the department.
Again, we share those frustrations as well. Like we were expecting to get a briefing from the department today on this here, and as I said at the beginning of the meeting, the fact that these reforms, the announcements for these reforms have come in, just amplify the need for this strategy, and we really need to get moving on it instead of next week. We want to see it now and actually get scrutinising and working on it and making it better, or having sight of it to work with the department to get the outcomes that we actually all want to see.
Very true, because I think the Minister said this morning, and he's entirely right, you know, the goalposts have massively shifted now. Yeah. This is a brand new challenge that has been laid on the table, and it's actually probably going to necessitate looking at the anti-poverty strategy and seeing how it can be used to support those people that are going to be impacted by this set of disability cuts.
We've worked before on the childcare strategy. We've discussed that there, and I suppose just going back to that and going back to other initiatives that you talked about, the holiday hunger payments, the excess school uniform, the initiatives around it as well, and that the £20 payment. Like, where would you like to see all those kind of come together and this year anti-poverty strategy to help children and families mostly? Yeah,
it's so important. Like, I think that the scale of the cuts on children, even just from 2023. You'll remember that we had no executive at the time, and Chris Heaton-Harris instructed that we had to fit into a very narrow budget, and then we had the permanent secretary of the Department of Education make so many serious cuts, and I worked with colleagues across education and psychology to look at the impact of those cuts. And again, we've seen the removal of the holiday hunger payments for 96,000 children. We've seen the removal of so many important schemes that were designed to close that COVID-19 gap that were totally stopped, and that's had again the biggest impact on our most deprived communities, and it's those deprived communities that are being lashed over and over again, and we are going to pay the price for this in the long term, you know, because we are seeing much more pressure on our mental health services. We're not seeing the investment that we need to see in mental health services. You know, according to my colleague, Professor Siobhan O'Neill, about 5 million this year. We needed 61 million. At all levels, it's going to be really disastrous. And we talk about educational underachievement. The key driver of that is poverty. And unless we deal with child poverty, which has significantly risen relative child poverty from 18% to 24%, from 1 in 5 children to 1 in 4 children now being in poverty, that is so serious. And I'm not seeing the urgency across our government around that. Even small measures like us having the lowest uptake of the NHS Healthy Start scheme, which we found in our research. The Healthy Start scheme is run by the NHS, and it's designed to help low-income parents afford milk and fruit and vegetables. Our uptake's in and around 50% compared to the other nations where it's up on 75%. And that's just a failure to adequately really promote and engage with that scheme, and making sure that there's working across the Department of Health, across education, across community, that joined up thinking and working to at least make sure that people in Northern Ireland are making best use of the scanty schemes that do currently exist.
You think I have to move on?
Yeah, no,
thank you.
Thank you. Sian, and then I'm going to Kelly.
Thank you very much. Thank you both so much. I think here we probably talk more about poverty and these cuts than I think anything else we've ever talked about. And I want to thank you both genuinely for your passion and your commitment to those who are suffering most. I'll get straight into it. In terms of the changes that are proposed, I think you're right, Ciara. Labour majority is far too big to ever overthrow this, unfortunately. So some measures will be coming in. Mm-hmm. If we were to pick out any to really target in terms of trying to get them either mitigated or overthrown, what, in your opinion, would they be? And secondly, on the cuts, is that we've seen mitigations being put in place potentially in England and Wales in the form of investment, mental health sector, sector, childcare, as you've mentioned. What do we need to be seeing happening in other departments here in Northern Ireland to mitigate that? And then I'll come back.
So I think the thing about these cuts is that they're doing away with the work capability assessment. So that means you have to qualify for personal independence payment in order to get access to the health element of universal credit. So really that's where mitigations become tricky, because you can't pick just one part to mitigate, because now they're interlinked and they're joined together. So like really we need to look at that requirement to achieve 4 points on a daily living descriptor, and you know, we have to start modelling what the cost of not putting that in place would be, and if we kept the current PIP assessment, what that would look like over the next number of years in terms of how much that would cost the Northern Ireland Executive, or how much it would cost here. In terms of what we need to do, you know, I'm on record as saying that we just simply don't have the public service infrastructure to deal with the fallout of these cuts, and we're going to make an absolutely deplorable situation that we're already in terms of NHS waiting lists, the mental health crisis, the situation in justice, you know, in social services, in social care, in that transition. One of the most frightening cuts for me is the fact that those young people between 18 and 22 aren't going to be able to access the health element of universal credit just because of their age. You know, it's a very arbitrary measure that Labour is bringing in. The most vulnerable groups of people, like care leavers, for example, who have PTSD, mental trauma, they're going to be destitute. So who's going to be able to support those people? Because they're going to have less independence, and they're going to need more support with being able to navigate, I suppose, charitable organisations to be able to get, to find means to survive. So it's really important that we look at mitigating all of it, because they're so linked together.
I just want to say, I also think that like it's not a done deal yet, and I think we need to act like this is something that can actually, we can do something about. And I think that if Stormont, and I know that actually every party has been quite articulate around that this is bad for Northern Ireland, bad for people with disabilities, but I actually think we need some creativity around what we can do. Like, you are our elected reps, and like we need as much noise and as much righteous anger while also planning, you know, around what do we do in terms of some mitigations. But I think saying, oh, this is a done deal is a mistake, because there are disabled campaigners all over these islands who are fighting and trying to actually make sure that these aren't implemented. Absolutely. And I think that as elected reps, you have to stand shoulder to shoulder to, disabled people against the cuts and other organizations, and you need to bring them in here and talk to them and find out all the things that they're doing in order to campaign, because it's not a done deal, and we can't pretend it's a done deal, because, you know, every crisis has to have a resolution, and hopefully if there's enough of a outcry around the specific elements of this that are so undignified and are so detrimental for the long-term sort of health, not only of people with disabilities, but also all of our public sector and our infrastructure, then, you know, I think that there is wiggle room for this to be changed.
And I think we can work really strongly with our other devolved nations, you know.
Listen, we have written to our counterpart committees in this respect. We are hearing that there's significant concern even within the Labour Party, so I absolutely agree. We should not allow the British government just to treat this as a done deal.
Thank you for challenging my lack of hope.
I'm going to have to move on then to Kelly. Go ahead, Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, folks. I think my reaction to the budget, and we knew sort of what was going to happen because of the announcement the previous week, but that was just to help to take the sting out of the Chancellor when she was coming up with her ideas. But here in Northern Ireland, I have some concerns about the Green Paper that came out and ultimately what has happened. So just taking you to it, we don't have a disability employment strategy, we don't have a disability strategy, we don't have a gender strategy, we don't have age, we don't have all of that. We have no strategies in place at this moment in time. The anti-poverty strategy could be an underpinning element even of all of those strategies. My concern is that the anti-poverty strategy, even when it does come forward, it's not in time for a budget for next year. So we will have people who will already be feeling the impact of the cuts at some point. My other concern is about sanctions. And we know that there is an intention to sanction people, an intention to sanction, not to make the best system that is inclusive as possible, but to sanction people. The Green Paper included discussion about employment supports that they have been piloting and using across the water, and says blatantly in it that Northern Ireland, it's devolved, it's nothing to do with us. So it doesn't even look like we're going to get a cut of Barnett consequentials on this one. Should we in Northern Ireland as a government be upholding the same sanctions that will be introduced through Westminster here, given the fact that we don't have the policies and the processes in place and the strategies and the employment supports for those people?
In short, absolutely not. And I think, you know, with the last welfare reform mitigations, the Northern Ireland Assembly took a very different approach to sanctions. And that was very welcomed, that they would engage with the individual at least 3 times before a sanction should be considered. And obviously very proud that Northern Ireland took that different approach, because the research shows over and over again that sanctions just don't work. We know one of the targets, we know people who are going to be targeted by these cuts to disability are people who have mental health issues, like depression and anxiety, and people who have neurodiversities. Look, I can speak from a personal perspective on this. I have a sister who has learning difficulties and neurodiversities, and, you know, as the proposals are at present, is most likely going to lose her disability support that gives her autonomy and independence from her carers, us. You know, I think if she was to engage in employment support, she really wouldn't have the capability to do that. It wouldn't be that she doesn't want to do it. It just she wouldn't be able to engage in that. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about, digging deep into the Green Paper and looking at, you know, how we can provide a more compassionate response to some of those proposals that are in there around how we're going to engage with people, because yes, all these people are going to be suddenly brought into this really intense conditionality. And look, I've been engaging with the department around this, because we now have in-work progression, and we know that work coaches are quite intently getting in touch, particularly with single parents who are working maybe, you know, 10, 16 hours a week, and trying to get them to increase their hours, and, you know, with no childcare or, you know, sub-parity in childcare. And I know that the senior civil servants I've been engaging with have been really helpful, and have been saying, you know, we have been explaining that we are different from the rest of the UK, but we can't help what some of our work coaches are taking in from wider society and wider media around what the regime is like in other parts of the UK. So it's really important that there's a specific position on that, and that's really firmly communicated to our work coaches and civil servants in Northern Ireland.
Just then, Becca, thank you very much for, at the start when you talked about the sort of things that we as a committee should be considering and the questions we should be asking about a strategy when it eventually comes forward, because it seems to be that the strategy will just appear. You know, we haven't had a chance to see a draft of that, and the working groups have explained to us about feeling set aside with some of those strategies. Ciara, you've just talked there about the need to engage with people. Can I ask you, what damage have we done with engagement through the failure to deliver co-production and co-design? Will we get back that excellent work that was handed over by the community and voluntary sector and organisations because of the way this has been handled?
I would say there's significant damage, and I don't think that things are ever irretrievably fixed. You know, things can be fixed, you know, but I do think that there is a huge feeling of dismay, despair. You know, people put a huge amount of work, and then it's also just feeling completely unvalued. And this is on top of people who are already doing a lot of research, doing these consultations, left, right, and center, submitting detailed consultations to, every month, doing research amongst their people with lived experience, and then feeling like even the messaging is not even getting, heard or taken up, or the main points aren't even talked about. I mean, this is sort of ongoing, and I feel like civil society, we can't scream any louder. We've been screaming, and I think that there's a real sense of we want to work in partnership. We want to see the work that we're doing reflected in policies. We also want to, we know not every policy is not going to be perfect. Actually, no policy will be perfect when it's implemented, and that there needs to be avenues around monitoring, assessing, come back and changing, fixing. That is how it works. And that if you shut down civil society and in our engagement, with that, then it'll be very, very hard. And it's also, we're constantly talking to people with lived experience and saying, tell us how this works for you, or this doesn't work for you. And it's like, there's going to be a certain point where they're like, stop asking us and stop bringing us forward to talk about all these different things, because nothing you're doing is changing it.
And that has happened.
And that has happened time and time again. And I know, the lived experience panel, our advisory panel, just last week we had a conversation and someone said, we've been having these meetings every 3 weeks. Do you think anything you've done has actually made a difference? And, I was like, of course. But I actually think that that's a legit question, because her life is getting worse right now because of the attacks on people in benefits, low wage work, etc., cost of living continuing to go up, rents going up. Her reality is that things are getting worse. And so,
absolutely.
Sorry.
And it can never be allowed to become a tick box exercise, and in some ways actually saying we're not even going to tick the box anymore. Fully agree with that.
Morale's just really low in the community and voluntary sector at the minute, because so many of our colleagues are even on redundancy notice, So then adding to the fact that the views that they've, pushed forward over the last 2 years aren't being valued is obviously very offensive.
Thank you. Brian, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming in today at short notice and for your paper. Thank you for updating us on the comments from the Minister. I hadn't heard that Gordon Lyons had said that this morning. I was busy reading papers for the committee. So I think you're saying that the strategy is expected
next week.
You'll bring it forward next week. So, okay, that is good news. Obviously, people will have views on it. I hear some criticisms from various people in this debate that haven't seen the strategy yet, so we look forward to seeing it, and then people will have their comments on it. In terms of the co-design, I mean, as the Chair said, we've been discussing that today for people to understand the terms of reference for co-design process, and I think ultimately I've made the point that it has to go into a departmental and a political process, and I think that decisions about public policy and public finances ultimately need to be made by elected representatives, and I think ultimately that is why those decisions have to be made, and that's the nature of democracy. So, I mean, I would push back at one of your titles there, exclusion of civil society, but that there will be an ongoing debate about that. In terms of what you've said, we've had 2 blows to people this week, the Green Paper, and again, the Spring Statement yesterday focused government at Westminster just wanting to make cuts to disability-related benefits, and we know that will impact huge numbers of people who are vulnerable. Will be more people in poverty because of that. So all parties will be doing what we can to speak against that and identify the consequences. And the Green Paper was titled Pathways to Work, and certainly, I mean, it is my view, it's my party view that people who are able to work should be working and should be enabled and supported to work. And we're aware that that's not possible for everyone, but there should always, it requires resource to be put into that to provide employability support and to ensure that employers are making the adjustments required. So we will be pushing to see the resource put in.
Brian.
Yes, my question is, for that assistance for people into work, would you point to some examples where you think the right sort of support is being provided, and we are aware of various organisations across Northern Ireland, including the voluntary community sector, who provide, like the Now Project, who provide support for people with disabilities and health-related issues.
I mean, again, I think the Now group does amazing work, and that's a really good example. Again, I can speak to personal experience. My sister was helped into work by an organisation called Triangle, which is based in Mid-Ulster, where I live, and she had a personal advisor that was such a good intermediary between like our family and the workplace, because we did have a lot of teething issues because of her neurodiversity, and we were able to get that personalised support, and she was able to advocate for my sister, to her employers about making small adjustments that would help her settle into the workplace. But again, that was funded by the European Social Fund, and we lost all of that investment, and unfortunately my sister lost that personalised support straight away. Now her employer has been able to keep her on, and she's being paid minimum wage. She's doing 4 hours a week, but I don't think that the employer would have the capacity to support her for longer hours without that intermediary to help through those issues, because I think they're doing a real job of work at the minute, sustaining her employment, and it would be really difficult.
Yeah, and just last comment. I mean, we're aware of those groups that had ASF funding then on shared prosperity funding, which has now been cut by 40%, and some of them, hearing this week that some of them aren't going to get the first payment until June in the new financial year, June or July. And there's whole cash flow issues for them. So, no, I mean, the government is going to have to put resource into this if they want to achieve that outcome of more people being helped into employment. That doesn't come without resource consequences.
Yeah. I mean, there definitely needs to be a resource, and I also think that bringing people in who've gone through a variety of these trainings will be important, because they will be able to talk about what those barriers were for themselves and what are those specific supports that made an absolute difference for them, and then which of these are actually scalable, and what are the local authorities doing within their sort of jurisdiction and remit in order to try to support the different workability programs and things like that. But I think the real key is that employers need worked with, and there needs to be training on the job, a real job, and that when it says a pathway into work, I mean, like Ciara's sister working minimum wage 4 hours a week cannot replace a benefit for her to survive. That is not enough, and so we can't see it as one or the other, but actually seeing that the ways in which the benefits actually allow people to have the ability to enter a workforce rather than cutting people off and stay in work rather than cutting it off at the knees, which I'm really afraid that even the ability to have some kind of stability is what you need in order to go to work is going to be cut off from people.
Okay, listen, thank you. We could easily talk for another hour on this, absolutely. And committee are very concerned, I have to say, around the engagement piece. Committee have expressed that view very, very clearly, our concerns around the engagement and the need to have that anti-poverty strategy with resourcing, with targets, and that makes a real difference brought forward. So that's something. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us, and I'm going to email you the quotes from our lived experience advisory panel, and I want to thank them also for taking the time to express their feelings for yourselves today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Liv. Okay, members, any actions arising out of that members briefly want to suggest, or will we we'll obviously be coming back to it in significant fashion as time goes on. Ciara?
We've heard that the strategy will be out. Can we ask if there's an option for a copy of the strategy to come to ourselves in advance of it being made public? Obviously it can be embargoed and it can be treated confidentially.
Yeah, members content, we shake that. Yeah. Thank you. And we have earlier asked, I think, that there would be no delay to the strategy. That was one of the things earlier, Claire. Yes, Kelly?
It's on a strategy. I was at an all-party group yesterday, and I was made aware that the Department for Communities are going back out and asking the sum of the disability sector to make comment on the disability, I think, employment strategy and the disability strategy, I think, and can we get clarification, is that actually one of the groups being consulted with that had been on the work streams? It's just to know what's that consultation on.
Yeah, we'll seek that, and we've sought further information around a number of strategies, and when we get that back, we will also maybe look at how we move forward on some of these. And it's important to reiterate, interlinked and interdependent strategies. You know, they all need to come forward in a way which support each other. Okay, members, thanks for that. I'm going to take a quick comfort break here, maybe a 5 or 6 minute break just before the next session. So could I ask the clerk to bring us out of broadcasting? Okay, members, thank you. So we're back. We are back confirmed in session?
We are back live, yeah.
We're not yet.
No, sorry.
Bear with me, Chair. We're
I don't know why it hasn't happened yet.
broadcasting maybe under some level.
We'll have to bring Andy in for that declaration.
Ah, there we go, Chair. We're live.
Okay, members, we're back in a live session. I'm just picking up again on the last, the actions out of the last session. Kelly, go ahead.
Yes, sorry, it's just to follow up on what one of the witnesses had mentioned about the PAC and the Audit Office report had questions in it. If we could maybe ask the department, who will be aware of those questions being posed, does the strategy and answer all of those, and just to help us with that. Yeah,
Members content with that? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm going then, members, to agenda item 10, which is a briefing by the People's Postcode Lottery. And before I go to bring in the member that's briefing us in, I just check, members, any declaration of interest?
Yes, Chair. Sorry, I didn't say at the start. I am planning to bring forward a private members bill on society lotteries. So,
okay. Interest. Thank you, Sean. Andy?
Yes, Chair. Charity trustee, please.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll also declare director of a charity as well. Yeah. Or trustee, should I say. Okay, members, so there's a copy of the briefing paper for this item in your table papers at page 57, and I'd now like to welcome the following representative to the meeting, Mr. Malcom Fleming, who's a Director of Public Affairs with the Postcode Lottery Group. Malcolm, could you go ahead and make a brief opening statement, and then we'll move to questions from members. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, just good morning. And thank you for inviting People's Postal Lottery to present to the committee. Before speaking about ourselves as an organisation, I'd like to reflect briefly on the presentation just heard from the Northern Ireland Anti-Poverty Network, because tackling poverty is one of the issues that lots of the charities that we fund in Britain actually work on, and indeed some of the members of the network are operational in Britain. And for example, today our players have raised 3.7 million for the Trussell Trust, 5 million for Magic Breakfast to provide breakfast clubs in schools, 7 million for Bernardo's, 18 million for Crisis, the homelessness charity, and also 23 million for another homelessness charity, DePaul. And in present, these funds are helping tackle poverty in Britain, and we think it would be impactful if they were also be able to help here in Northern Ireland, where, as we've just heard, there is also significant need. To move on, People's Postcode Lottery is a company with a social purpose. We are owned by a not-for-profit foundation and were set up in Great Britain in 2005 purely to raise funds for good causes. We are part of the Postcode Lottery Group, which also operates similar lotteries in 4 other countries, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway and Germany. In Britain, we have over 4.4 million players, or to put it another way, around 7,000 per constituency. It is a subscription model, so players pay £12.25 a month with their postcode as their ticket number. Our focus is on maximising funds for good causes. In Britain, our players now raise over £19 million a month for charities. This includes 126 large charities and thousands of local community groups. Charities receiving support cover a wide range of charitable causes, from supporting health charities such as Breast Cancer Now, Alzheimer's Society and the RNIB, to those protecting the environment like the Wildlife Trusts, the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust and the Woodland Trust, those protecting our heritage such as the National Trust, the National Museums of Scotland and Wales, and also those working with animals, such as Riding for the Disabled, Dogs Trust and Cats Protection. Charities working in the fields of international development, sport, and those supporting young people and the elderly also receive support. Crucially, it's not just about the amounts of money though, but also about the way funds are awarded, with the vast majority of these funds being unrestricted funds, giving maximum flexibility to the charities to spend the funds in the way that has a maximum impact. Most of the funds are also given for the long term, supporting charities year on year, giving them the confidence that they will have the funds available into the future, allowing them to make strategic and impactful decisions benefiting the communities they serve. At a local level, our players have funded thousands of small local charities and community groups with grants of between £500 and £25,000. Last year, the average value of community grants per constituency was £50,000, and this amount is increasing over time and indeed has quadrupled since 2019. Of course, lots of the larger charities we fund, or our players fund, also have a local footprint in constituencies. However, as you know, we do not operate here in Northern Ireland, and that is because the legislation covering charity lotteries in Northern Ireland is different from that in Britain, and effectively does not allow us to run a charity lottery with one player base covering England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Despite not operating here, quite a lot of our adverts end up here, meaning people already know us. This has meant that for many years, residents of Northern Ireland have contacted us asking to sign up, charities from here have asked to access funding, and indeed politicians have asked us why we can't raise funds for charities in their constituencies. And that is why we have been looking into the possibilities to try and boost charity lottery fundraising in Northern Ireland, both by People's Postcode Lottery but also by other charity lotteries. We calculate that if we could extend People's Postcode Lottery into Northern Ireland, our players would raise £25 million for good causes within the first 5 years, reaching over £7 million a year from year 5 onwards. This would benefit many local community charities and larger Northern Ireland charities. It would also allow our existing charity partners, like those I have mentioned, to use funds in Northern Ireland. Crucially, this would come at no cost to the public purse. I'd also like to touch briefly on two specific matters. Firstly, the issue of gambling-related harms is a live political issue here as elsewhere. We take no view on the wider gambling sector except to point out that charity lotteries are a very different product from, for example, gaming machines, online casino games and sports betting. Firstly, charity lotteries exist for charitable benefit, not private profit. But secondly, lotteries, and especially subscription lotteries, are low risk from a gambling harms perspective. This is partly because of the low event frequency, with draws taking place once a month, meaning you can't chase losses. Unlike the National Lottery, People's Postcode Lottery also does not offer scratch cards or online instant wins, and we place a limit on the number of subscriptions you can take out. The second issue I'd like to touch on is the National Lottery, and we very much support the work of the National Lottery, not least because many of the charities our players support also get funds from the National Lottery. Charity lottery fundraising is complementary to the funds raised by the National Lottery. And that's something you don't have to take our word on. The nature of the funding, that complementary nature, is clear from the annual statistics published on the sector by the Gambling Commission and shown in our briefing. And as you can see from the table on page 3 of that briefing, sales of the National Lottery have grown over the last decade and a half. At the same time, sales from the charity lottery sector have also grown, helping to raise record amounts for good causes. The Chief Executive of the Gambling Commission, in evidence to the House of Commons Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, also talked about how charity lotteries presented no threat to the National Lottery. Ministers at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport regularly speak about wanting both types of lottery to thrive, and the DCMS Select Committee, in its 2022 inquiry report on what's next for the National Lottery, stated, "We do not consider that society lotteries pose a threat to the charitable giving of the National Lottery, in line with the views of the Gambling Commission and the Department. Recent years have seen significant reforms to society lottery legislation that have allowed total sales and good cause returns to reach record levels, at the same time as the National Lottery has achieved record sales." If so minded in terms of how to best pass legislation to unlock these funds for Northern Ireland, we are relaxed about the best process to do that and are very happy to work with MLAs, this committee, the Communities Minister and his executive colleagues to find the best route. We warmly support the work being done by Shan Mulholland, who has brought forward a member's bill. But if the easiest route to obtain the required changes is through a legislative consent motion and some tweaking of the 2005 Gambling Act at Westminster, that would also be fine with us. Ultimately for us, it is securing the funds for Northern Ireland charities that matters. Chair, to conclude, we see this as a great opportunity to raise more money for good causes in Northern Ireland at a time when it is badly needed, benefiting all local communities in the constituencies you represent. There are not many new funding raising opportunities for charities, so let this be one that we embrace. However, clearly it will only happen if Northern Ireland wants it to happen, so my ask to the committee is to work with us to help make it happen and secure this ongoing annual funding boost to charities and community groups here. As I said, we reckon it will be 25 million over the next 5 years and 7 million thereafter. It's not something I think the voluntary sector here can afford to lose out on, and the sooner that is enacted, the sooner they can benefit. But really they need the money urgently. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. And I suppose a couple of things that I was going to ask. You've touched upon the gambling-related harms issue, and I know you've identified that as low risk. I suppose part of the concern for committee is the other part of that harm matrix is around regulation, and we have very poor regulation here. But I know, so I'm making that as a comment more than anything else. I was also going to ask about the impact on the National Lottery, but you've touched upon that. So I will then instead ask in relation to the National Lotteries required by law to set aside a certain amount to charitable causes. Is the amount that you set aside voluntary? What's your minimum requirement, and what guarantees are there around potential changes to that in the future which may negatively impact?
So at the moment in Britain, the charity lotteries have to return 20% of every draw to charities. People's Postcode lottery actually voluntarily returns over 30%, and there's no private profit involved in that. So it's something, I think the charity lottery sector as a whole has a very good record of having a good return in the pound to charities from the player's stake, as it were.
Okay. And in terms of any plans to change that, or is that either up or down? Is that level? I
think what's important for us is that actual amount of money we raise at the end of the day in terms of real terms, not necessarily the percentage. So you obviously can have a smaller percentage of a larger amount of sales would generate more for good causes, but basically it's having whatever works to get the most money for charities is ultimately the aim. But certainly would be well within whatever the statutory limit of 20%, which you're already well ahead of.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to go first of all to our Deputy Chair, Nicola Brogan, and then I'm going to Brian and Kelly.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Malcolm, for the briefing. Just following on from Colm's last question, that 30% that PPL provide to charitable organisations, are you under the same law as the National Lottery, or is that just the figure that you do provide, or is there a minimum amount that you must provide under law, or is that what's that?
So it's a different law. So the National Lottery is covered by the National Lottery Act, and charity lotteries are covered by the Gambling Act in Britain, and the minimum is 20%. So that's a statutory limit.
For both?
For charity lotteries. The National Lottery, I think it's actually a licence condition as opposed to in law. But I know there's a different. The lotto game, is my understanding, it returns 28%. But scratch cards, for example, an online instant wins return significantly less. But that's I think that's a licence condition as opposed to a law. But you'd have to. I would absolutely take my word on that. But that's my understanding.
No, fair enough. Thank you. And listen, you said in your opening remarks about the real level of need here at the minute for the community and voluntary sector, and any additional funds would obviously be very welcome because they are extremely stretched at the moment. And you talked about raising about 25 million over the next 5 years in the north. How do you identify different organisations or groups that actually need this money, or have you already identified them, or how do you go about that process?
Yeah, so we have, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have different types of funds for different types of charities. We have an open application process for small charities, mostly charities whose turnover is under $250,000 a year, and to be honest, lots of them are well under that. So that goes from grants of £500 up to £25,000. So that's an open application 3 times a year. And then for larger charities, which we fund on a thematic basis. So we'll fund charities, for example, in heritage or in sport, etc., etc. And basically, there we'll look at the sector and ask charities to apply and have a conversation with them about how to fund as and when the funds are available. As I mentioned, what we try to do with the larger group of charities is have an ongoing funding. So we fund charities year on year. But happily, we're in a situation in Britain of continuing to grow, which also means there's more funds available year on year, so we can bring more charities on board. And that's something we'd obviously be keen to do here as well, and have a mix of charities here. Would be the small local charities could also apply, but also I imagine you would definitely have some of the larger Northern Ireland charities would apply. But also there's lots of charities we already fund who have work in Northern Ireland, and I can tell you that their colleagues in Northern Ireland are very much aware that their colleagues in Britain have got the funds that they use for some of the work, and they can't access it here. So from day one, almost without selling a ticket, they could suddenly start accessing that money. The charities could put some of it here if they so desired, and I'm sure some of them would. But it is really, as I mentioned, a lot of the funding, the vast majority of the funding is unrestricted funding, and that's because we believe that the charities are better placed to know how best to spend the funds than we are, and that by doing it that way, actually, we make our funding go further and have the most impact.
Thank you. Just one final question. I suppose it's already been touched upon, but there are concerns have been raised that if the People's Postcode Lottery was to come to the north, that it would affect the amount of money coming from the National Lottery into the community voluntary sector too, and into charitable organisations. Do you think there's space for both, or how do you think it would be impacted, or what's your response to that?
Well, absolutely, there's space for both. They both work in Britain, and don't take our word for it. Take the word of the ministers in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, of the Gambling Commission, and of the DCMS Select Committee. All have looked at this issue, and indeed only in January, the Civil Society Minister, Stephanie Peacock MP, said in the Commons that she very much welcomed the work of society lotteries and wanted them to thrive. She wouldn't be saying that if they thought that was damaging funding from the National Lottery. And from a charity perspective, a lot of charities get funding from both types of lottery, not from us and from other charity lotteries. And what we're proposing is not just to help us, it's to help all charity lotteries, but also from the National Lottery. And quite a lot of the National Lottery money is often restricted funding, so it's project funding. But our unrestricted funding can help for core costs, for example, of a charity. So it could be staff, or it could be utilities bills, whatever is required. And that combination of funds can often work quite well for charities as well.
Thank you. Brian, go ahead and rise, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Malcolm, for attending. I would accept that the People's Postcode Lottery is a different model to the National Lottery in many ways. And you've explained about, in terms of the potential for gambling-related harm, that there are restrictions in how much people can gamble and the nature in which it's done. So I just want to ask a bit more about the consequences of changing the legislation. So you explained that the National Lottery was created through a specific act at Westminster, which I presume was to prevent a proliferation of similar national level lotteries, so say a bit more about, if we were to change the legislation here, would that open the door not just for People's Postcode Lottery but other lotteries to set up here, and what is the current situation? I understand in England you would have like hospice lotteries, there are more lotteries than we have here, but equally, some sports clubs will do their own. I don't know if they're official or unofficial. So just what would be the consequences of changing the legislation here?
Yeah, so in Britain there are a large number of charity lotteries. I think there's roughly about 450 charity lotteries. All sorts of things from air ambulances to hospices to sports clubs benefit from that, and that's, you know, the figures in that graph are actually the whole sector's been growing and is helping generate funds for good causes, and that's something that's, you know, there are obviously charity lotteries here as well, but they're much smaller in size, and they can't benefit from that wider.
Can other charity lotteries operate here then? Under
So at the moment,
existing legislation?
there are some charity lotteries operating here under the current legislation, but they'll be quite small. Even with some changes that have been made to the Act, to the 1985 order in the past, and are being proposed. But actually, you know, for example, local hospice lottery, for example, is one of the lotteries in Britain which raises funds for for hospices. They've been approached by the hospices, Northern Ireland Hospice, to ask them if they raise funds for hospices here, and if the same problem as we have, they can't do it because of the current legislative situation. They reckon if they could operate here as well as in GB, that would be at 1.4 million for hospices here, which I can tell you is also very badly needed. So yeah, there's multiple benefits, I think, from this, from what we're proposing, not just for the charities who benefit from what we're doing. And for example, a lot of other organisations, charities will run lotteries themselves. So organisations perhaps working on supporting people with particular illnesses or disabilities will sell lottery tickets, but can't sell them at the moment to perhaps supporters in Northern Ireland.
Is there a restriction on the scale of what lotteries can currently operate here? What is, you're saying some charity lotteries do operate here legally, is that right?
Yes, so there's basically caps on sales.
There's a sales limit?
There's sales limits, and there's also caps on prizes. Right. And that's basically what means you can't have, well, it means you can't have them at the same scale, but also it means because those caps are different from that in GB, basically the two bits of legislation don't work together to basically mean you couldn't operate. You're very quickly getting a problem. For example, if your top prize in Belfast was different from your top prize in Birmingham, soon people would be complaining if their postcode came up in the draw. So you need to have something that works together.
Right. So is the change in legislation that you're seeking, would it be generic, or would it wouldn't be naming people's postcode lottery, or?
No, it wouldn't be naming people's postcode.
It could open the door to other lotteries then?
Yes, which we see as a positive. We think that's a positive thing, because it would mean that, the regulation of those lotteries as there are as currently.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Brian. Kelly.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have a number of questions that you might be able to give one-word answers to. So Nicola has already, to be honest, asked one of them. And Northern Ireland is a marketplace. And in that marketplace at the moment, with regards to lotteries, as you say, there's other small charitable lotteries, but the National Lottery for 30 years has been there. Can I just double check then? So the National Lottery at the moment, we have that because of Westminster legislation, and we know my colleagues looking at legislation for people's postcode lottery and such to come into Northern Ireland. But I'm just trying to think about that market in Northern Ireland. So currently we have National Lottery, and they do provide for good causes here. I'm just wondering, the National Lottery in Northern Ireland, we benefit from players elsewhere in the UK. Is it a case then that when people's postcode lottery comes here, that it will be the money raised in Northern Ireland, the good causes in Northern Ireland benefit that portion of that money, or is it something that comes in for the whole of the UK players?
Our proposal would be that you benefit from the whole of the UK market. So, the same as the National Lottery, you could, and that's also partly because of our ethos of giving the most flexibility to charities. So the charities might one year think, well, there's more of a need here or a need there. So that's we think that's the best way of doing it.
And you mentioned there about it's a subscription of $12.25 per month.
Yes.
Is that paid by direct debit?
Direct debit. I mean, sometimes I think you can also do it by PayPal, for example. But yes, yeah.
And then I'm just thinking about that direct debit piece, because the National Lottery, as we know, you can go online and top up your account and do things like that. But has the subscription increased because of rate of inflation or anything like that? How's that gone?
Well, it stood at £10 a month for quite a number of years. Then a couple of years ago, increased to £12 a month, and then £12.25. So it's slightly increasing, partly because of costs of everything as inflation generally. But that happily has resulted in us being able to also significantly increase the funds to good causes, because if we...
And I'm just wondering, those that pay by direct debit, are they notified in advance of any increases and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Any change to our terms and conditions under the rules set by the Gambling Commission, we have to tell all of our players. Yeah. I suppose one of the differences with the National Lottery is because the National Lottery, you can play by going to a corner shop and buying a ticket without having to give your name and address. We know who absolutely all of our players are. Yeah. We quite literally have their postcodes, so we obviously have to tell them if we're changing the terms and conditions of how they play, which would include a change to the price.
I'm very excited by the potential of 7 million, but it's sort of 7 million that will be made up of some of the money that would have been going to the National Lottery, and some of the players are coming to people's postcode lottery in the future. But I'm just trying to think, to get to that 7 million for Northern Ireland, have you a rough idea of how many, and please forgive me on this because I don't understand this, in the People's Postcode Lottery you've got one postcode for a house. Does that mean it's one ticket per house, or can every person in the house pay for it? So I'm just trying to think of what would be the ticket sales you need to achieve to get to that 7 million for good causes?
Well, first of all, we think it will be an additional 7 million. We don't really see it as being, if you look at the figures in GB, they've grown alongside the National Lottery. I don't see any reason why that should be different here. But but in terms of the post, how it works with your postcode, basically your ticket number is per player.
Okay.
But postcodes, it varies a little bit, but a postcode often covers about 15, 20 odd houses. So if you're playing and your postcode's in the draw, which means if you win, your neighbours also win. Mm-hmm. So it's really about communities winning together, and that's a important part of the model, and one that's very popular with lots of our players. Yeah. And
have you any idea of sort of the ticket sales that you?
Well, we basically I think at the moment is about 15% of players of households in GB have a player playing. So that we reckon it would take about 5 years to get up to that equivalent level in Northern Ireland. But actually, what we've found is, having spent more time here over the last period, that people know us already, because a lot of the advertising ends up here, even though we're not trying to spend money advertising here because we can't sell it. So actually, a lot of people have said, "Oh, I'll definitely play," and we've even had people saying, "Well, I don't normally be involved in gambling or that, but just the fact that I've been annoyed by it saying you can't play is enough to get me feeling that I should play." So I think I would have no problem in terms of getting sales to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Malcolm, for coming along today. Appreciate your presentation, and we'll keep an eye on this issue, and we'll see if there's any further actions coming out of today's session.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, members. So, members, I'll check if there's any follow-up. One of the things I did want to suggest was, I know that the National Lottery has already also requested to brief the committee, and I propose that on the back of this briefing today, we invite them in to brief, as you know, so that they're sort of, we can consider both together. Andy, go ahead there.
Yeah, Chair, could we maybe ask for a raised paper on it to bring all of the different elements together?
There was.
Sorry, Sean, go ahead, Sean.
All right, let me just.
Sean's going to give us some information on that, Andy.
If I can just get it. Sorry, Andy, there is a raise paper. It was in Society Lotteries raised December 24. I've just realised that might just be mine. Hold on. Let me just double check. It might be just as a result of my paper, but there has been a raise paper, so maybe just ask if that can be shared.
Yep. So, just let me check, Andy, what specifically would you want raised, and maybe we can get a sense of whether this is additional to the paper we already have. So what would you want?
Just the different elements, the nuances to what's being proposed. Obviously the postcode lotteries play differently, so is there going to be an impact on retailers, for example? How many people move from the National Lottery or other lotteries to play the postcode lottery? Are these new players? So just assessing the wide range of permutations.
Yep. Well, listen, Andy, what I suggest is maybe have a look at the original raise paper, and if there's further issues, bring that back, and we can either in the session with the National Lottery or as part of a separate that, bring it back if you're not content, or if you feel there's more information needed. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, content, sure.
Yeah, Sean?
I'll be going out to consultation next week, and then I'll obviously be communicating with the committee to come in and answer questions anyway, so some of that I can probably bring up. if I can't share the raise paper, if that was just personal because I'm bringing forward the PMB, I can maybe bring up with members at that point.
Okay, and we'll look about getting that raised paper shared.
Just check it, Chair, to see if we can locate it.
Yeah, we're taking a look at that now at the minute.
Yeah, it was December 24, so it's just called Large Society Lotteries, 10th of December.
Not on their website at the moment, but we'll request that.
Yeah. For an individual.
Yeah,
So we'll check.
We'll look at that. We'll circulate that. And if there's further information that raised would add to the to this topic and discussion, then we'll seek that. So if members are content with that approach, yeah. Okay, members, before I go on to agenda item 11 there, just to flag up that we will need to defer now that draft report recommendations on the arts sector, that closed session we were going to do. Time is not going to allow us to do that today. So could I ask members you have received in table papers that report. Could I ask members to take a good look at that report, and when we reschedule then members will have an opportunity to comment if there's any suggestions that they want to make. All right, members content?
Perfect.
Thank you. So moving on then to agenda item 11, members, which is a briefing by Civic Initiative on Citizen Forum on Housing. So the papers for this agenda item start there at page 221, and we will now welcome the following representatives to our meeting this morning, or this afternoon as we are now. So we are joined now by Les Allenby, and Les is independent chair of the Civic Initiative, and Emma D'Souza, who is Civic Initiative lead and co-facilitator. So, Les, I believe it's yourself maybe that's going to make a brief opening statement, and then we'll go to questions from members, if that's correct.
Yeah, I think Emma may say something too, but I'll be very brief. First of all, thanks for the invitation, and really appreciate this. What I was going to do was say just briefly something about the purpose of the Civic Initiative, and that was to road test the idea of that communities are still very engaged and interested in local policy issues, and we particularly wanted to see whether there was an appetite for civic engagement through a citizens' assembly, and we did that through setting up a series of community workshops, running a citizens' assembly, and then doing some polling on the public's views, and Emma will take you through a little bit more of the detail. The starting point for this was both the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and the New Decade New Approach Agreement. We know the Civic Forum didn't sustain itself, but it was recognised in New Decade New Approach that there was still a need for an umbilical cord between citizens and politicians, as the New Decade New Approach document talked about putting a civic engagement and public consultation at the heart of decision making, and there it talked about setting up a community compact panel and the idea that through the executive there would be one or two areas selected for civic engagement, and one of those was including a citizens' assembly. So we wanted to see whether the idea that had been agreed by the political parties in 2020, there was an appetite from the public. What we found, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but just to give you some reassurance in effect that actually a citizens' assembly and the work we did complements the work that you do rather than replaces it. And it's probably important for me to say that Kelly was there for the 3 days and was somebody who can obviously tell you directly whether she feels what we're saying is true in practice. But first of all, one of the things that we found was that around a third of the people who were selected had not voted in the last election, but over 54% of those who participated said they were more likely to engage again in this kind of approach. And also we discovered by surveying people before and afterwards there was a much better understanding of your work and the dilemmas that you face as politicians in terms of policy making afterwards. So there was considerably greater sympathy for politicians and the work you do as a result of engaging themselves in the policy dilemmas when they were realising that housing wasn't just about building more houses, but there were issues of infrastructure, etc. The second bit of, I suppose, an anecdote which says something about the appetite. There were 88 people at the first 2 days. The third day was held in Derry, Londonderry. It was a Saturday. People were asked to give up that Saturday, and it turned out to be a day when, if you remember, in February there was torrential rain, flooding of the line at Coleraine. Trains couldn't get to Derry, Londonderry, and yet 70 people found ways of getting there to Derry. So there clearly was a willingness for people to, once they were engaged, to continue to engage in the process. And the third, I suppose, thing just to say before I hand over was when we started this in the community workshops, it straddled the period both before and after the Assembly and the Executive came back. And again, what we found was there was much easier and greater engagement once you were all back. And there was it was a real struggle to get people to meetings, to have discussions. So people were disengaged when there was not the local institutions. When they came back, we actually found there was much greater engagement. So our overall, and we'll come back to our questions, is that actually what's envisaged in New Decade, New Approach is, including citizens' assemblies, does have a value, and it complements the work that the political parties are doing here, and you can use it to road test ideas, to get a sense of where people are on issues, or to look at kind of practical solutions to problems, or to have a kind of input. And it's a legitimate part of, as I say, rebuilding that trust between citizens and politicians and political parties. So I'll hand over quickly then to Emma just to say a bit about the work that in practice.
Thank you very much, Les, and thank you, Chair, and to the committee for the invitation to speak here today. I won't keep you long with some remarks, but just to give you a little bit of context in terms of the practical outworkings of this process that we adopted. So the topic of housing was selected for the Citizens' Assembly model. That topic was selected following 38 community-based workshops that we did right across Northern Ireland, 3 of which also took place in Monaghan, Cavan and in Dundalk. Those workshops included 518 people who took part in a 3-hour facilitated workshop. In that process, they identified what their priority areas were. Health, housing, education were the most selected topics for people to examine. Culture was the least selected out of 8 topics they could have discussed on those days. Following that process, housing was selected, and we enlisted Sortition Foundation, which is a UK-based NGO that does recruitment of participants for citizens' assemblies to select people to take part. They sent out 25,000 letters of invitation to people across Northern Ireland at random. Of those invitations, people then would register. They could do that by a QR code, by a telephone number, and through a website. And of the 343 people who registered their interest in taking part in a Citizens' Assembly model, we then selected 100 people to come forward for the Citizens' Forum on Housing. In that process, we then ended up with 84 people who went through the 3 facilitated days of deliberation with the Citizens' Forum on Housing. In terms of some demographics on that included 45% Protestant, 37% Catholic, and 18% other. In terms of educational attainment, there was a broad range of educational attainment, including 6% no qualifications, 15% level 1, 10% level 2, 27% level 3, and 42% level 4. It was spread across age ranges and also across the geography of Northern Ireland to ensure that we had a representative sample of Northern Irish society. Of those citizens, they then deliberated over the course of 3 days through a participatory democracy structure. They heard from 18 expert speakers, so it was quite condensed in comparison to some other Citizens' Assembly models that take place in the UK or in the Republic of Ireland. Over the course of those 3 days, they took part in small table discussions with facilitators. They examined key issues. They heard from speakers ranging from construction workers to the housing executive to renters' rights organisations, and they were very robust in their questions. They ratified 38 recommendations by a consensus vote of 80% plus, and they created a shared vision for housing. As my colleague Les has already said, there was a shared determination from those taking part in the Citizens' Assembly model. The pace at which they actually developed relationships, considering that these were people who had never taken part in a Citizens' Assembly model before. These weren't policy heads like us sitting here today. These were regular citizens who were coming into a topic that they had quite a low level of knowledge on. They self-identified their knowledge of housing to be 4.4 on average when they went into the process. When they came out of the process, it was 7.8 on average. And we also know that they became more engaged in politics, with 54% saying they were more likely to engage in political processes as a result of taking part in this assembly. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much both. And just to say, personally, I have to say I'm very interested in the process and the overall, and that's from a point of view of engagement and participation. I think we should and can do much more of that. We've talked about co-design and co-production here throughout this committee meeting, and I see this as fitting into that same where there is value in including more people in the discussion. You get better solutions, you get more voices of experience. So I'm very interested in the process in that sense. I have also sat in as an observer on a previous one that was done around loneliness, Red Cross and some of the other organisations did. And I think it provides an opportunity for a really focused, detailed exploration of complex issues that we don't necessarily always have, and I think there's a real role to be played in that part. A lot of it is in terms of the rigour of how it's set up, and I suppose I'm conscious of the potential power that lies within the facilitator, but in any of them I've seen, I think the facilitators are very professional and very able to set themselves up outside of the process to facilitate, and I think that's something that really should be a key part of it, and I know is. I also think technology means we can expand participation and we can apply better analysis to what's coming through greater levels of information. So I just want to say that in general, I'm intrigued by it, and I do think it has. We've seen some examples of where it has played a really important role, and I think can in the future. So getting down to the specifics, then, I have two questions kind of interrelated, both from two different perspectives in relation to the work itself. So some of the more popular policies that were endorsed by the Civic Forum include giving the housing executive power to access and borrow private finances, and also to buy up public land for housing. So why do you think those policies resonated with the participants of the forum?
Maybe I'll kick off, yeah. I think what they realised very quickly when they heard from a range, so they heard from everybody from House Building Federation and developers through to the housing executives, chief executive, tenants groups, and they learned very quickly that there was an enormous waiting list for social housing, the things that you're all aware of, the difficulties, and I think they then moved quite quickly into a kind of, well, what is the solution focused? Interestingly, quite a lot of the people, as I sat in on the conversations, were social housing tenants. So there was a kind of interesting mix of people in terms of the tenure in which they lived. So I got it was a very strong early on sense that we need to do shift gear and a sea change, and we need to kind of think about how you do that. So that's where I think the kind of recognition and desire for things like the housing executive to be given greater powers to finance. There was a recognition that there are a range of tenures, so and that home ownership was perfectly legitimate. The other strong thing that came through, which I think most people in the Citizens' Assembly hadn't realised, was just how important water, sewage, and investment in that infrastructure is. And that was kind of one of the, I think, the interesting things that people hadn't realised fully, that this wasn't just a DFC social housing and wider affordability issue. There were lots of other things that played into this.
Yeah, I think I would pick up on that. At the point about water charges, water infrastructure is important, right? So we had a consensus process for this where you needed 80% for it to be a ratified recommendation, which is quite a high bar to try and get that level of consensus within this kind of structure. But I think what is notable is some of the recommendations that didn't hit 80%, but were still quite well supported. And actually, water charges is one of them, where 64% voted in support of water charges if that is being used to fix the problems of water infrastructure. So you can see that there is a process of people who would probably have come in maybe not supporting. We know that the public in general does not support water charges if you were to do a public opinion poll. But when you give people a space to examine why that might be necessary and why that might be something that will help address an issue, you can see that people can shift their opinion. And I think that's a really valuable process, especially for politicians when you're trying to make difficult decisions and you're trying to get public buy-in for why that might be a difficult decision to have to take. But the point around why they took that process, we only had 3 days, which actually is quite a limited amount of time. If you look at comparable structures in the UK or in the Republic of Ireland, people are given a lot more time for a citizens' assembly structure. We were limited by the resources that we had because we were trying to test this model to see if it would be effective. And with that in mind, we were very solutions focused from the beginning. So not only did we ensure we had a range of speakers that were going to give different perspectives, but we also made it clear to speakers who were coming in that we want solutions. We want to hear from you as to what the answer might be or what you think the solution might be. And also the people who were taking part, all the citizens knew that their goal here was to find an answer, find a solution that might work. And that was reflected in how they asked questions of speakers, how they interrogated the topic. And they could see, I think, quite clearly that there was a limitation on the Housing Executive in terms of what they could do, and that what they were trying to do through those recommendations was find ways to unlock the potential of the different stakeholders that we have available to us to fix the housing crisis.
Okay, thank you. And then on the flip side of that coin, so some of the less popular policies which were not endorsed then by the forum include things like increased taxes on second and third homes and ending the use of guarantors. And just last week we heard from students in particular around the difficulties that the use of guarantors and very specifically have to be from here. So why do you think those policies didn't resonate as well with participants?
I think the participants were coming at it from a very top level approach. So their first priority, from what I could ascertain through their facilitations, was trying to get more houses on the market and increase access and availability. In terms of trying to get consensus from that level of society, getting where we were with the 38 recommendations is quite good, but I think the limited amount of time that we had might have limited the ability to interrogate some of these other aspects, like the things like guarantors and other issues in more detail. I think if the forum had more space, there would have been more space for debate and dialogue. You know, we covered a broad range of issues, but we did that in a very limited amount of time, and I think if they were given more space, they might have interrogated those issues in more detail.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Ciara?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Liz, and thank you, Emma. As you said, I attended as an observer, took no part in the processes, just to observe on the last 3 days whenever the housing issue was being brought up, and I have to say that I was astonished. The presentations by the expert bodies that were brought in, I thought this is going to lose people. There's a lot of information, and to be honest, I was very naive as to how well the group understood, asked questions, and actually then were able to come forward with as you say, solutions. As an observer, it really drew to me that this is not something that politicians should be afraid of. It is a mechanism that can either help to coalesce around a policy or to help to see where a policy could go to. And the one thing that I just wanted to ask is about that process, because I know the housing outcomes that happened and I'm very excited by some of them and it's where they're going to go. But I wanted to check the housing subject that was picked. At the end of the day, it wasn't going to be as controversial, say, as you know, if we talked about end or start of life or, you know, something like integrated education, for instance. It wasn't controversial. Everybody had an experience of living in a house. So that helped, I think, with that group. But I'm just wondering, what expectations did the participants have of what was going to happen to the outcomes that they discussed? And if it had have been outcomes that were decided, say for instance, if the number one thing had have been out of this and the media had picked up on it about water charges, there would have been people very concerned about that and wondering what was that going to happen. Is there any thought to how you could protect those participants or support them if in the future a civic initiative was on something that was more controversial, and to help those people to deal with the outcomes of, say, being attacked because they have taken and made a decision that, or a recommendation that the wider public hasn't had the opportunity to think about in the way that they have, and how they've come to their position?
Yeah, there are processes. There are examples actually elsewhere of taking really difficult issues. In the South, an abortion was one. A citizens' assembly was used. I don't think anybody thinks that the citizens' assembly then becomes whatever the citizens' assembly says goes. But what citizens' assemblies are often about, and end of life might be a good example, whether you should have tax varying powers might be a kind of another one. It's to take difficult issues, and I hope we did it with the people who are involved in this, and say, what we want is your views and voice to be heard, and then to go, it still goes somewhere else. The decision making is not taken by the Citizens' Assembly. And it's about then starting with hearing, not just you're going to get a plurality of views, but it actually also allows people to hear from the various diverse aspects of that. The example in the South was very good. You had pro-life, pro-choice, you had nuanced within that, and you get a sense of where citizens are. Yeah. And that process is embedded in, I mean, our one, we'd hoped to have 100, we had 88. There were 88 chosen at random. And inevitably you get some people, for example, with us, who knew quite a bit about housing, because it is a kind of lottery. You had others who knew next to nothing. But almost all of them on housing had a lived experience of the issue. And where I think is really important, take tax varying powers. It's the difference between saying to people, well, do you want to pay more tax? Well, I don't think you need a citizens' assembly to answer that. But if you said to people, would you be willing to pay more tax in the following circumstances, you start to road test ideas that might be valuable then to politicians. And this is a genuinely more participative process than what we tend to have, which is a kind of series of phone-ins that tend to be adversarial, and people who are either absolutely wedded to one position or absolutely wedded to another position end up debating. And you have a sense actually that people out there get turned off by that, and we want to kind of move away to getting a genuine feel for what citizens think, and that's intelligence for you in your deliberations with party policies, etc. One of the things that I learned from this there were things that I would have been, personally very strongly take a view about. I'm not a big fan personally of the right to buy. It takes away from the decent stock that the housing executive has, etc. Well, it was clear only a third of the people in the Citizens' Assembly were against the right to buy. On the other hand, there was something like 85% said, we want to retain the right to buy, but the money should go back into more house building. So it gives you that nuance between a kind of yes and no to the shades of grey.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Kelly, just because I want to give you some details on ways to protect participants. So in terms of expectations also, so the participants taking part in the Citizens Forum on Housing, they were first onboarded, so they would have received a phone call saying they had been successfully selected. I had the great pleasure of doing many of those phone calls myself, and the response from people getting that phone call, they were delighted to be selected. They didn't think they were going to get selected, and it was really a great privilege to be a part of that process, to see how excited people were to be a participant. They received an onboarding phone call, they received an information pack in advance, they received 2 further phone calls from our team to ensure that they knew what to expect, knew what was going to be happening, had any questions. So it was really about trying to ensure people were as prepared as they could be for the process. When they came into the room, they were given further information packs and they were given details on the processes that would be taking part. They also were given the ability to not be part of any videos or photos. So if they wanted to be not taking part in any kind of like front-facing positions, that was something they had the option to do. I think the success of the 3 days, given that we had such a broad range of people right across society, including people who, as Les has said, were renters or social housing. We also had landlords in the room. There was a real broad range of people. I think the success is creating a space where they did feel safe, it did feel inclusive. They also felt a shared responsibility. They knew that there were other people that wanted to be in that room and they weren't in that room. They were the ones that were selected, and they felt a responsibility to wider society that they had to try and fix what was quite clearly a big problem, and a lot of them didn't realise how big the problem was until they were in that space.
We're going to have to keep moving on for time pressures catching up with us now. Nicola, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Les and Emma, for your presentation. I think this is very positive. I think it should definitely be welcomed. And the fact that people taking part had a better understanding of government and the challenges of facing government and the consequences of making decisions, that is a positive thing. And hopefully that 1/3 that didn't vote the last time will vote the next time, when they become more engaged in the whole political process. I really have one question in regards to the membership and how it was made up. So there was 38 workshops initially. 3 of those, I think you said, were held in border counties. Is that right? So was that participants from the south then that took part in those workshops? And then with regards to this civic forum, were there anyone from the south involved in it? Because it just strikes me that the 3 priorities that were outlined, health, education and housing, I think that's affecting people right across the island. So I just wonder, is any thought being given to actually having a holding a forum right across the islands, not just in Ulster?
Yes, there were not any members of the forum were Southern participants. We did have evidence from 2 Southern experts on issues related to housing, because there's a lot of learning to be gained from both sides, both jurisdictions, in terms of the issues. The reason that we had a couple in the border counties is because a lot of the issues impacting people around socioeconomic rights are an all-island issue, and border counties in particular. Someone myself as a border county person know that a lot of that is similar in terms of the impact of it. There is, of course, the ability to do this on an all-island basis. We were very conscious of the political climate around trying to first address the concerns around the use of citizens' assemblies, and we chose the language of citizens' forum particularly because we wanted to highlight that while sometimes there was an association of citizens' assemblies with the Republic of Ireland, actually citizens' assembly structures are used globally around the world. They've been used in Denmark since the 1980s. The UK has had over 30 of these in the last 3 years across the United Kingdom, and we wanted to try and first normalise the use of these assemblies and show the enormous potential that there is within society for this kind of structure. But in terms of logistics, in terms of practicalities, certainly there's nothing to prevent doing an all-island assembly on an issue that's been identified as an all-island issue. Things like climate and biodiversity are quite an obvious one, or issues around all-island healthcare and healthcare access could easily be done in that process too.
Yep, I agree. I think, as said, those are issues that do affect people right across the island, something maybe we could look at in the future. But thank you both.
Thank you, Nicola and Brian.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for coming in today. Certainly, we welcome any engagement of people generally in political and societal matters, and many people do that through involvement in community voluntary sector groups, through lobby groups and so on. I will take issue with the wording you have in the background context, that you say that the civic forum, you describe it as being the umbilical cord between citizens and political institutions. So actually I would say the umbilical cord is elections, and political parties and people becoming involved in political parties. So those of us who are here because we're elected and have a mandate. So that is the umbilical cord. People sometimes talk about political representatives and community representatives. So actually, political elected representatives are community representatives because they're elected by the people and have a mandate. We've had this debate already today about public policy and decisions about public resources, taxpayers' money. Ultimately, needs to be made by people who you can vote out if you don't like the decisions that they make. And people who have a mandate and are elected to make decisions and set public policy. So mandate is important in a democracy. But I appreciate people want to contribute their ideas and their views, and looking down your list to see a lot of good proposals there, a lot of good ideas. But as I say, mandate is important. So to actually change public policy under scrutiny of the media and the public, ultimately I think people need to engage in the democratic process. You're doing that today, you're presenting to us. I don't see the prospect of us establishing a civic forum here, but that's not to say people can't involve themselves in exercises like this, engage with others, educate, put forward proposals, So,
okay. Brian, answer in two ways. One is none of this is to take away from the democratic legitimacy of elected representatives and representative democracy. This is about complementing that. It's not about usurping it. The second thing I think to say is that the percentage of people who vote has dropped gently but slowly, but it's in decline. So as I say, a third of the people who took part in this citizens civic forum hadn't voted in the last election, but they were engaged in issues. So there is an electorate out there who are civically engaged but are not politically engaged. And it's in all of our interests to have those people politically engaged. And that includes, in the way that you're talking about, a mandate every 5 years or a vote every 5 years shouldn't be the only way in which people participate in their local society, etc. So, and the other thing, which is, but if you don't have, and it's one umbilical. It's not in the same way as the democratic mandate is not the be all and end all. A citizens' assembly approach is not the be all and end all. But what it does, it can provide you with intelligence. It can provide better public education about what the issues are about. It can foster a greater understanding and trust of politicians and the dilemmas they face. It actually strengthens democracy rather than in some way undermines representative democracy. And if you look back to New Decade, New Approach, what's recommended there is the idea of a kind of compact panel that bring forward ideas, but ultimately it's the executive who would decide what the topics would be in a citizens' assembly. So this would still be about representative democracy, if you like, having the say in how that complements. So it really is about dovetailing, not about two separate things that somehow are not interconnected.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And just to say, in the interest of balance, it has been discussed several times at today's meeting and previously, and Brian's point is noted in terms of his being a member of this committee. However, the committee has very strongly, as a body, expressed our support for a co-design process and that should be done. And we have been critical of the department in relation to how current co-design processes are being managed and the future potential of further co-design processes. So we just want to put that on the record as well. But listen, thank you. That's interesting outcomes and an interesting process, and I look forward to looking at that in further detail as time goes on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Members, any other actions or follow-up actions members want to flag as a result of that, or are we content to move on? Go ahead,
just
Ciara.
to flag, there's an event on Monday evening at 5 o'clock in the Senate where there'll be more detail provided about the report.
Okay, thank you for that information, Kelly. Okay, members, moving on then to item 12, which is a forward work programme, and that's contained at page 287. Do members have any comments, or are they content to note the forward work programme? Kelly?
Could I just double check? I know that it's a colleague of ours, so I'm just asking. Danny Donnelly's due down for the 3rd of April meeting. It's just if we could maybe let him know a bit more detail about what's going on, because I think he's had a change in researcher recently, and it's just, I've said to him, it's on the forward work plan, Danny, but I think maybe it's just to confirm when we need him. Yeah.
And we've been in contact with him. But we will contact him again, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Members otherwise content?
Thank you,
Chair. Members. Agenda item 13, members, any other business? Do members have any other business they wish to raise today? No? Thank you. And then, members, date, time and location of our next meeting. Our next meeting will be at 10 a.m. on Thursday, 3rd of April 2025, here in room 29. The meeting is now adjourned, and I'll ask the clerk to take us out of broadcasting.